I suppose we should begin with a confession. Not a dramatic one, merely a quiet truth spoken while the candles burn low. My name is Emiel Regis Rohelek Terzief Godefroy. These days people call me Regis and show me their wounds, boils, fractures, fevers, the occasional missing finger. To most of the continent I am only a travelling barber surgeon, a cautious man with clean instruments, a leather bag, and a talent for listening more than he speaks. It is a pleasant misunderstanding, and I have encouraged it. It is convenient to be mistaken for someone harmless. Kingdoms fight, borders bend, banners change colours faster than autumn leaves, and no one looks twice at the man rinsing bloody bandages in the river. They look to kings and generals, witches and sorceresses. History strains after their footsteps. I sit in the corner, sharpen my razor, and watch them hurry past. Tonight, if you are willing, come sit with me by the fire. Imagine damp cloaks steaming on a line, an iron pot grudgingly simmering, the distant roll of war drums muffled by forest and fog. Out there, armies are manoeuvring in the dark. In here, there is just enough light for a story and just enough shadow for honesty. I will tell you how I, who wished only to slip unnoticed through this age, found myself walking beside a witcher named Geralt of Rivia, in search of a girl called Ciri. When I first heard their names, I had no idea that the road toward them would be paved with ash. I first felt the world tilting not in proclamations, but in the rhythm of the wounded who reached my table. There were too many of them, arriving too quickly, smelling of burned cloth and fear. Men who should have been ploughing fields or arguing with millers were instead learning what steel feels like as it passes through flesh. They came from different directions, yet told the same story. Nilfgaard pushed north again. The northern kingdoms tore at one another while speaking of unity, and villages disappeared between them like crumbs brushed from a table. Threaded through these accounts, like a stubborn refrain, was a rumour. Somewhere near Brokilon a witcher had been seen. White hair, cat's eyes, swords on his back. Some claimed he travelled with a bard, forever talking and forever afraid. Others swore he sought passage into the Dryad's forest, wounded and unwilling to die. In the same breath, the soldiers would mention a girl, a child of destiny, they said, a lost princess, a weapon, a blessing, a curse. Each tongue shaped her differently, yet each story left the same taste of unease, as though the whole war were secretly tilting around a single, invisible point. At first, I treated these tales as I treat most prophecies, with courteous interest and inward disbelief. People cling to destiny for comfort, as they cling to amulets or lucky coins. When the world becomes uncertain, they prefer to imagine that someone somewhere holds a map. Live long enough, and you learn that maps tend to burn with the cities that draw them. Still, as I cleaned wounds and changed bandages, I noticed how stubbornly the same two figures resurfaced in every new version of events. The vanished girl and the witcher who sought her or fled her, or perhaps did both at once. You may know this feeling on a smaller, kinder scale. There are seasons in an ordinary life when every conversation seems to circle back to the same illness, the same broken relationship, the same name at work. You tell yourself you are merely an observer, that these matters do not concern you. Yet somehow The tide draws closer to your doorstep with each passing week. We like to believe we choose our journeys. More often, the journeys choose us and then wait patiently until we are done, pretending otherwise. For me, the choosing began in a village that smelled of wet straw and river mud. I had turned a stable into an improvised surgery. 3 planks for a table, a lantern, a bucket that pretended to be clean. Rain ticked on loose tiles overhead. A young soldier sat before me, jaw clenched while I bound his leg. His hands shook with the effort of silence. It was a day that should have slipped unnoticed into the grey heap of similar days. Then came the sound of hooves in the yard, the clatter of harness, the particular jangle of armour too polished for men who sleep in ditches. A small detachment rode in, their cloaks bearing the colours of a northern house still pretending not to be at war. Their captain demanded the local commander. There was no commander, only a sergeant whose eyes had forgotten how to rest. Someone fetched him. Someone handed him a sealed letter. I continued wrapping the soldier's leg and pretended not to listen, which is one of my oldest and most useful habits. The sergeant's mouth tightened as he read. His gaze flicked once toward me, weighing something, then dropped back to the parchment as though it might soften if he stared long enough. Later, when the riders had gone and darkness had made honesty easier, he spoke. Not because he trusted me, I think, but because words can grow heavier than armour if no one helps you carry them. There is talk, he said, that the dryads of Brokilon are sheltering someone they should not. A witcher. Maybe more than one. Orders are coming. Patrols will be sent. No one wants that forest watching us while we bleed. Brokilon. The name fell into the stable like a stone into a deep well. An ancient forest, old even by my standards, famous for grudges and disappearing men. The idea of a witcher lying wounded under the care of dryads sounded unlikely, which is one of the reasons it might be true. War is an excellent arranger of improbable alliances. Pain is an even better one. That night, with the lantern burning low and the horses shifting in their stalls, I found my thoughts returning again and again to the nameless witcher in the rain-drenched forest. I pictured sap-scented hands tending his wounds, distant drums reshaping borders he had not drawn, the world sliding toward some new order while he drifted between fever and waking. I wondered what promise or what failure would send such a man back into that world instead of vanishing into some quiet valley and allowing history to exhaust itself without his help. We rarely admit this, but the suffering of strangers often calls to us more loudly than their joy. A contented man may be left to his peace, a wounded one, even when he lives only in rumour. Tugs at the sleeves of our conscience. I told myself that my interest in this witcher was purely professional, the curiosity of a healer about unusual constitutions and rare poisons. Yet something else had stirred beneath that excuse, something I had thought long buried alongside an older, crueler self. Looking back, I recognized that moment as the first glowing coal dropped into the dry straw of my carefully ordered existence. A name overheard at a roadside fire, a scrap of gossip in a field hospital, a sleepless night turning possibilities over like stones. The world beyond my small circle of lamplight was already aflame. I had only begun to notice the smoke creeping under the door. At that time, I did not yet know Geralt of Rivia. I had not heard Ciri's name spoken with the mixture of tenderness and dread it would later command among us. All I possessed were whispers, and a restless awareness that I stood at the edge of a road I had sworn never again to walk. And yet, if I am honest with you, I already understood the soft, persistent sound beating within my chest. It was the question I had postponed for decades. How long can one remain apart when the world itself is passing through its own baptism of fire? And when the flames at last reach our doorstep, will we discover that our carefully guarded neutrality was only a more dignified word for fear? We promise ourselves that we will answer such questions when the proper moment arrives. But we still wonder whether, by the time we finally rise from our comfortable chairs and open the door, the choice was made for us long ago. The rumours did not arrive all at once. They came in fragments, like torn pages from a book the world was trying to read aloud. One evening it was a deserter who had thrown away his shield in a ditch full of reeds. Another day it was a peddler whose cartwheels had seen more corpses than customers. Later it was a woman carrying her sick child, eyes glazed with exhaustion. Each of them crossed my path. Each of them mentioned the same two names without knowing they did so. Some spoke of a witcher who had fallen in a great confusion of magic and steel on an island of mages. Others insisted he had been cut down somewhere nearer the Yaruga. Geography blurred under the pressure of fear, yet the outline was consistent. A white-haired mutant, badly wounded, taken toward Brokilon. The Dryads had accepted him. The world, already astonished that the forest tolerated an occasional human, now gossiped wildly about a witcher lying in their care. Dryads and witches do not feature often in the lives of ordinary soldiers. Yet I noticed how my patients leaned forward when they reached this part of their stories. Their voices dropped. This was not just news. It was myth stirring in the mud of everyday misery. A witcher who refuses to die. A forest that refuses to yield. People clutch such images when logic fails them. Side by side with the witcher's rumour moved a second one, more formless and therefore more haunting. They spoke of a girl. Sometimes she was a princess of a fallen kingdom whose emblem they could not quite remember. Sometimes she was the child of the elder blood. Sometimes merely a little sorceress with ash on her cheeks and a sword in her hand. The details shifted like smoke, yet her presence was oddly constant. Wherever someone invoked a different future, they invoked her. It is tempting to dismiss such talk as a soldier's attempt to endure the senseless. If the fighting is about a girl, about destiny, about some ancient blood and hidden plan, then the blood in the mud acquires a story. Pain, as I have watched countless times, becomes easier to bear when it can pretend to be meaningful. Perhaps that is why the rumour did not fade. It was useful. It allowed the dying to imagine themselves as footnotes in a larger design. Still, there was something unnerving in the way the two threads intertwined. The witcher recovering in Brokilon. The girl seen in visions, in dreams, in terrified whispers from scouts who had supposedly glimpsed her. I met men with bandaged shoulders who could describe nothing of their own battle, yet could recount with great conviction a tale they had heard in a trench. A white mare, a rider with ashen hair, a scream that was not entirely human. They had not witnessed it, yet they spoke as if they had. If you think this strange, consider how quickly gossip circulates in an ordinary town during calmer times. A neighbour moves away in the night. By sunrise, 3 new explanations have sprung up, each more inventive than the last. We tell these stories not because they are true, but because they help us shape the shapeless. The larger and more terrifying the event, the more desperately we reach for narrative. War is the greatest of all such events, and the continent at that moment was ravenous for any tale that promised a centre to the chaos. My own reaction was complicated by knowledge I did not share. I knew what a higher vampire is and what he remembers. I had seen empires rise and fall, although I had watched them from a comfortable distance. I had learned, through long discipline, to let human storms break over my head without being drawn in. Yet these rumours unsettled me in ways I did not like. Part of it was the forest itself. Brokilon is not merely a location on a map. It is an old will that has refused compromise for longer than humans can count. I had always respected that. There is a purity in such stubbornness, even if it occasionally devours lumberjacks. For the dryads to shelter a human, to shelter a witcher no less, suggested a disturbance deep in the roots of things. Part of it was the description of the man, a mutant hunter of monsters who, wounded to the brink of death, is carried into a forest that hates mankind. He survives. He heals. He does not disappear. Instead, the stories hint he prepares to leave again, driven by something stronger than the instinct for self-preservation. These are not the actions of a man at peace with the world or with himself. And part of it, I admit, was the girl. I have seen many children die. It is an occupational hazard for anyone who chooses to work near battle lines. The hardest part is not the death itself, cruel as that is. It is the way adults around them rearrange their memories afterward, weaving the child into elaborate legends to numb their guilt. A child is rarely allowed to remain simply a child after war has touched them. So I listened. I stitched skin and set bones, and said little while people poured their rumours into the space between us. Over time, I became something like a mirror. They looked into my quiet gaze and saw reflected back the outlines of their own fears and hopes. The witcher became braver with every telling. The girl became more dangerous or more holy, depending on who spoke. Nilfgaard grew either monstrous or misunderstood. The North grew either heroic or hypocritical. The war itself became a stage on which they tried to justify their own part. In such moments, it is easy to feel detached, almost superior. One can think of oneself as a calm observer, a stone in the middle of a torrent. Yet, if you stand in the stream long enough, the water shapes you too. I found my route choices bending slightly. I no longer lingered in villages that faced away from Brokilon. Without admitting it, I drifted closer to the forest's sphere, the way iron filings drift toward a magnet whose presence they refuse to acknowledge. Perhaps you recognize the pattern. There are times when you pretend to be above a situation among your own friends or family, a dispute that does not concern you, a colleague's misfortune, a neighbour's heartbreak. You tell yourself you will remain neutral, untouched. Then one day you notice that every story you hear, every small decision you make, nudges you toward the center of that very storm. You still insist that you are simply minding your own business, yet you have already changed your road, your schedule, your habits. I told myself I was following the wounded, as any decent healer would. Wherever soldiers limped away from the front, I would go. Where they mentioned a forest full of mists and arrows, I told myself it was merely a landmark by which to chart their injuries. Only in hindsight do I see how I leaned closer whenever Ciri's name surfaced, how I memorized each new version of the witch's fate. We flatter ourselves that we are rational creatures who shape our path by clear thought and deliberate choice. But we still ask ourselves whether it is not often the quietest stories, repeated over weak campfires and in reeking barns, that truly guide our steps. By the time I met Milva, I already knew her story in fragments. She did not like talking about herself. Her tongue was better suited to scolding, to dry mockery, to warning us exactly where not to stand if we wished to avoid catching an arrow by mistake. Yet even the most guarded souls relax around a fire when the day has been long, and the wood smoke gentles the sharp edges of memory. Her name at birth, she said, was Maria Baring. To us, and to most of the borderlands, she was simply Milva. Names, she implied, belonged to people who stayed where they were born. She had not. Long before our paths crossed, Milva had become a familiar shadow at the edge of Brokilon. Few humans could walk those borders and return unpierced. Fewer still were invited back. Yet the Dryads had come to tolerate, even to trust, this dark-haired archer who moved between forest and field with the wary ease of a fox. Her alliance with the forest began not with ideals, but with necessity. War drove refugees and deserters into the trees, and the trees, being old and slow to forgive, answered with arrows. Somewhere in that grim exchange, a human woman with a bow refused to run. She learned to speak with the Dryads, which paths were merely dangerous and which were mortal, how to lead out those whom the forest, on rare days of mercy, agreed to spare. When she later spoke of these things, it was with a shrug, as if anyone would have done the same. I knew better. Most people, given the same circumstances, would have died or turned away. Milva walked back and forth until the roots knew her step. The Dryads used her as an intermediary with the outside world. Northern commanders, partisans, and frightened peasants learned in turn that messages carried by Milva almost always reached their destination. She was no diplomat. She was the courier of last resort, sent when ordinary riders would lose themselves in the undergrowth or the crossfire. She moved between scouts' camps, hidden clearings, and smoky taverns, forever grumbling, forever alert. Milva did not speak of loneliness. She spoke instead of logistics. There were too many injured fleeing the war, not enough paths left passable. Nilfgaardian patrols grew bolder near the forest. Northern commanders, desperate for advantage, begged for information about movements through the trees. She snorted when she mentioned them, their maps and sealed letters. Maps, she said, look impressive until they meet a swamp. It was during this tired dance between forest and front that another message reached her, one she tried hard to refuse. The Dryads had sheltered a witcher, badly hurt. He was recovering. When he could walk, he would go. But he was important, not to kings, perhaps, but to something older and harder to name. Ethne the forest's queen, had sent word. When the time came, the Witcher must be guided out. He must not be allowed to hurl himself back into the teeth of the war too soon. Someone had to remind him that he was not simply a sword the world could pick up and swing. Milva argued, of course. She had little patience for witches. They walked through blood and were praised for keeping monsters at bay, while the same mouths condemning Nilfgaard ignored the ordinary cruelties that required no fangs at all. She had seen too much of human nature to trust a man whose trade existed, because people preferred to hire someone to kill their nightmares rather than face the smaller horrors they committed in daylight. In the end, though, she went. One does not refuse Brokilon lightly. Beneath her irritation lived a conscience as stubborn as any dryad's oath. Perhaps she also felt, without yet admitting it, the pull of the currents that move beneath events, drawing certain people toward one another like leaves caught in the same whirlpool. When she first told me about meeting Geralt in the forest, her account was anything but romantic. He was stiff with pain and impatience, angry at his own weakness, demanding to leave. The dryads insisted he stay and regain his strength. Milva found herself trying to persuade a man who had spent his life walking into danger that just this once the wisest course was to remain still. Their early conversations, she said, were short and sharp. He asked about the war, about Nilfgaard, about movements along the Yaruga, then, more cautiously, about rumours of a girl. That last question she tried to dodge, but even then there was something in his eyes when he spoke of Ciri. Not the greed of a commander discussing an asset, nor the glow of a fanatic speaking of prophecy. It was a quieter intensity, the kind that makes people cross impossible distances because they genuinely cannot imagine doing otherwise. You may have seen such a look far from any battlefield. A parent waiting in a hospital corridor, a friend who refuses to give up on someone everyone else has abandoned. From the outside, we call them stubborn, foolish, or brave, depending on the ending. In the moment, what we see is a line drawn deep inside them that will not shift. Milva recognized that line in Geralt, and she disliked it, perhaps because she carried a similar one in herself. It is uncomfortable to see our own obsessions mirrored in others, especially when we have worked hard to disguise them as practicality. So she watched him. She listened as he pieced together news from her reports and from fragments dropped by passing fugitives. Every fresh hint about Ciri seemed to deepen the shadows on his face. Armies might be trading castles and provinces, but for him the map had narrowed to a single destination. Later, when she recounted all this by our campfires, pretending to be absorbed in mending a strap or checking her arrows, I could hear in her voice the moment when her mission ceased to be a favour to the forest and became something else. Responsibility, perhaps, or the first reluctant step into another person's fate. We like to think that we choose whom we help by clear reasoning. We list pros and cons, weigh risks, tell ourselves we are being sensible. But we still wonder whether, beneath all of that, there is a simpler recognition at work. A moment when we look at another person's burden and know, without being able to explain it, that part of it has already become our own. The first time I saw Geralt of Rivia, he did not look like a hero of ballads. He looked like a man who had argued with death and only barely won on a technicality. The field hospital was a barn that had once housed cows. Now it held 20 men on straw pallets, and the lingering smell of old milk, sweat, and disinfectant. Rain drummed on the roof. The army had moved on, leaving behind its wounded as armies often do. A few village women, a boy too young to fight, and I were left to pick through what the war had discarded. I was bent over a soldier with a shattered collarbone when I heard the commotion outside. Not the usual groans and curses, but something sharper, like the clash of two very different worlds. A female voice, impatient, insisting. A male voice, answering with weary authority. Another male, higher, almost theatrical in its indignation. The door opened and Milva entered first, tired and mud-spattered, bow on her shoulder. Behind her came a man in a tattered yet flamboyant doublet that must once have been purple, his lute slung across his back like a wounded bird. Between them, leaning heavily on the archer's arm, walked the Witcher. Even among the broken bodies on those pallets, he drew the eye at once. His hair was as white as the rumours claimed, tied back from a face that seemed carved from old stone. The eyes were the unsettling part, not simply their colour, that feline amber, but the way they took in the room, measuring distances, exits, threats. While pain tugged at the corner of his mouth, his left side was bound in stained bandages. He moved as if every breath reminded him of a debt unpaid. Milva guided him to the nearest empty pallet without bothering to ask permission. The bard fluttered around them, protesting the indignity, the smell, the damp, the general failure of the world to provide a more suitable setting for his suffering. Only when Milva told him that he could always wait outside in the rain did he quiet down, muttering about barbarism. "Who is in charge here?" Milva asked. I straightened, wiped my hands on a cloth, and stepped forward. It is remarkable how authority can be assumed simply by standing calmly while everyone else is shouting. She studied me for a moment, as if weighing whether my quietness was competence or stupidity. "He needs your hands," she said, jerking her chin at the Witcher. "The Dryads mended what they could. The road has done its worst ever since." Geralt looked at me then. There was no plea in his gaze, no gratitude in advance, only a professional measuring of another professional. He might as well have been judging a swordsmith by the state of his tools. I found that oddly reassuring. It is easier to work on those who still view their body as an instrument rather than a burden. I examined him. Broken ribs, some not yet knitting cleanly, bruising old and new layered like bad paint, a wound that had once been deep and ugly, now closing thanks to time and dryad herb lore, yet strained by travel. Exhaustion threaded through every muscle like wire. No infection yet, but the possibility waited in the wings. "You should have stayed in the forest 3 weeks longer," I said. "At least." "I did not ask your opinion of forests," he answered. His voice was rough, with a fatigue that made it almost gentle. "Can you keep me walking?" There was the essence of him. Not a request for healing, only a demand for functionality. For a moment I felt a flash of professional irritation. Then, against my will, a flicker of respect. The bard, who would later insist I call him Dandelion, intervened at this point. He explained at great length, and with considerable embroidery, that Geralt had survived a cataclysm on an isle of mages, that he himself had risked his noble life in the process, that destinies and royal intrigues and unspeakable horrors were involved. His account was light on concrete details and heavy on adjectives. I let him talk. While he spoke, I saw the way Geralt's eyes slid away at the mention of Ciri, not the blankness of a man concealing a tactical secret, the quiet flinch of someone hearing a name that has become more wound than word. After sending the boy to fetch hot water and clean cloth, I set to work. My hands moved with familiar precision. Splints were adjusted, bandages changed, herbs measured. Somewhere behind me, Dandelion continued to narrate his own heroism, turning the barn into a stage. Milva stood to one side, arms crossed, observing us all like a hunter, judging whether the assembled tools would suffice for the task ahead. Geralt endured the prodding and tightening with stoic silence, broken only by the occasional sharp intake of breath. When I pressed along his ribs to test their alignment, his hand tightened reflexively on the pallet. Not once did he tell me to stop. Many soldiers, much weaker than he, had tried to negotiate with pain, as if one could haggle with reality. The Witcher understood that the only way past was through. For all his restraint, I saw something else in him as I worked. A strain that had nothing to do with bone or muscle. Each question he asked was not about his own recovery, but about travel times, border crossings, rumours from the south. When he spoke of Nilfgaard, his tone was hard but almost indifferent. When he mentioned Ciri, the air seemed to tighten. Later that night, after the barn had settled into its usual chorus of snores and whimpers, I found him awake, staring at the beams above. The rain had stopped, and the silence between drops felt almost luxurious. I sat beside him with a cup of bitter infusion that pretended to be tea. "You will be able to walk," I said, "in a few days, with a stick. In a couple of weeks, without. If you rest, if you let your body speak louder than your stubbornness." "I cannot wait weeks," he replied. "You can," I said. "You choose not to." The corner of his mouth twitched. It was not quite amusement, but it was close enough to count. Dandelion would have written a whole stanza about that almost smile. To me, it simply meant that the ice between us had cracked a little. We spoke then, not as healer and patient, but as two professionals who had worked too long in fields where other people's fear dictated the terms. I asked about poisons he had encountered, about how his enhanced body responded to certain herbs. He asked about the patterns I had noticed in the wounded flowing north and south. It was, in its own way, a polite exchange of trade secrets. You may recognize such moments from an ordinary workplace, far from any battlefield. Two people who should have nothing in common find themselves comparing notes about impossible deadlines, difficult clients, sick relatives. On the surface, it is a simple exchange of information. Beneath it, something more important is happening. A bridge is being built, plank by quiet plank. Milva joined us briefly, grumbling about patrols and foolish commanders. She did not stay long. Sleep always stalked her faster than the rest of us. Dandelion, of course, slept like a stone, the gift of those whose conscience is agile enough to dodge anything that might disturb it. When the others had gone, Geralt's voice dropped lower. He asked what I knew of Broccolon's latest dealings with the outside world, of rumours about a girl matching Ciri's description. I had little to offer beyond the scraps I had gleaned from my patients, but I laid them out as carefully as surgical tools. Each small piece of information he held up to the light, turning it this way and that, searching for a pattern. I watched him. I saw how the thought of that girl narrowed his focus until the rest of the war blurred. Armies moved, kings plotted, sorceresses whispered. For him there was only the thread that might lead to Ciri. He was, by temperament and training, a professional killer of monsters. Yet here his fear was not for himself, nor even for the world, but for a single lost child. We like to imagine that great events are shaped by grand ideals and strategic brilliance. Yet we still wonder whether, in the end, it is not simply the fierce love or guilt or longing for one person that drives us to cross lines we swore never to cross. No army trumpets announced the forming of our company. There were no oaths sworn under banners, no solemn speeches. It began instead with a question asked in a muddy yard behind the barn, where the wounded groaned and the horses stamped their impatience into the dark. "How far south can we go without running into a full battle line?" Dandelion asked. Milva snorted and named a road that was not on any map. Geralt listened without comment, hands resting on a stick I had insisted he use. I watched them all, as I always did, from a step behind the conversation, where words reveal more than they intend. The army had moved on days before. The field hospital had shrunk as the least wounded limped after their units, leaving behind those whom no one expected to march again. My work there was almost finished. There would be other barns, other villages, other improvised tables waiting for my instruments. I could have left that morning, as I had left so many places before, stepping sideways out of history's path. Instead, I found myself asking Milva about safe crossings, about supply, about distances. The questions did not sound like mine. They sounded like those of a man contemplating a journey rather than an exit. Geralt had made his intention plain. As soon as he could manage more than a few hours in the saddle without collapsing, he would head south in search of any trail that might lead to Ciri. The idea of remaining behind did not seem to occur to him any more than the idea of ceasing to breathe. I have met religious fanatics with less conviction. Dandelion declared that he would, of course, accompany his dear friend. He said this with the air of a martyr choosing the stake, though his eyes flickered toward the road where rumours clustered like crows. A bard goes where stories gather. War, for all its horror, breeds stories like a forest breeds leaves. He would follow, he insisted, in order to bear witness and to restrain Geralt from his more foolish impulses. Milva hesitated longer. She had already guided the Witcher out of Brokilon, arguing and cursing all the way. Her task, according to the forest, was complete. She could have turned back, slipping again into the familiar pattern of paths and clearings. Yet each time she spoke of it, her voice lost conviction. A line had been crossed somewhere between the trees and this barn. Guidance had ripened into responsibility. As for me, there was no reason to go. I had no stake in the fate of Cintra's princess, in the quarrel between north and south, in the manoeuvrings of kings and mages. I had my tools, my discipline, and my carefully cultivated obscurity. The wisest course was obvious. Nod politely to the white-haired Witcher, wish him a safe journey, and walk away. Wisdom is something we praise more often than we practice. The decision announced itself in a simple sentence that surprised even me. "You will need a healer," I said. The yard fell briefly quiet. Dandelion brightened at once, already composing verses about the valiant surgeon who followed them into the jaws of war. Milva raised an eyebrow, scepticism and relief mingling on her face. Geralt looked at me with that steady, unblinking gaze that weighed possibilities like coins in a palm. "I cannot pay much," he said, "and there will be no safety to offer in return." It was a strange way to welcome someone, stripped of flattery. Many people, when asking for help, wrap their requests in promises they cannot keep. Protecting you will be easy. The danger is minimal. We will manage. Geralt offered none of that. He simply laid the facts on the table like metal instruments before a difficult procedure. "I did not mention payment," I answered, "and I am not fond of safety. It makes one complacent." That earned me the ghost of another almost smile. Our bargain, such as it was, needed no more words. We left the barn the next morning under a pale, indecisive sun. Geralt mounted with care, his jaw tightening as his ribs complained. Milva moved ahead, scouting the road and the scrubby fields beyond. Dandelion rode beside the Witcher, occasionally glancing back to ensure his audience had not vanished. I followed slightly behind, my horse carrying my medical bag and the small bundle of belongings I allowed myself. The road showed us what war looks like between battles. Burned wagons, their wheels sunk in dried ruts. Fields where crops had been trampled and never harvested. A farmhouse with its doors hanging open. The silence inside heavier than any cry. Smoke drifting from far off, never entirely absent from the sky. We stopped often. At first, I insisted on it, under the pretext of adjusting bandages, though we all knew it was because Geralt's body demanded it. Nilfgaard and the North could quarrel over territory. Healing obeyed a different schedule. He tried not to show his frustration, but the way he stared down the road each time we paused said enough. In the evenings, when we found a patch of ground that did not squelch underfoot, we lit a small fire and shared whatever food we could gather or buy. It was in those stolen hours of rest that we began to shift from a collection of individuals walking in the same direction to something like a company. Not a noble fellowship chosen by prophecy, but 4 tired travellers who learned how to arrange themselves around the same circle of light. Dandelion complained constantly about the damp, the food, the state of the roads, the ingratitude of the world toward artists. Yet he also listened. Under the layers of vanity and self-pity lived a sharp mind and a heart more loyal than he would ever admit. He coaxed Milva's stories out of her, then mine, weaving them into a tapestry of words that made the days feel less identical. Milva remained our harshest critic. She scolded Geralt when he tried to push his body too fast, glared at Dandelion when his chatter attracted unwanted attention in taverns, and eyed me with suspicion whenever my knowledge of anatomy threatened to reveal more than a simple barber surgeon should know. Yet it was she who rose first in the mornings, she who checked our horses, she who stood the longest night watches without complaint. As for me, I observed, I watched the way Geralt's shoulders tensed whenever someone mentioned Ciri. I noted how Dandelion's jokes grew more frantic on days when rumours from the south sounded particularly grim. I saw Milva's expression soften for a heartbeat when she thought no one noticed Geralt sagging slightly in the saddle. You may have experienced a gentler version of this process. A new team at work, a group project at school, neighbours thrown together by a shared problem such as a leaking roof. At first, everyone clings to their separate roles. Over time, in small exchanges of food, help, and exasperated laughter, something else forms. You begin finishing each other's sentences, anticipating each other's habits. Without fanfare, you become a we. On the road, this transformation is accelerated by danger. A joke shared after a tense encounter with scouts does more than lift spirits. It engraves a shared memory that can be drawn on later when fear returns. A cup of water handed silently at the moment of greatest fatigue becomes a kind of unspoken contract. Some nights, when the others slept, I listened to the forest. Not Broccolon yet, but the thin, scattered woods that still separated us from the true front. Wind in the branches carries stories for those who have ears to hear them. I heard the creak of old trees, the restless stir of animals displaced by marching troops, the distant thud of engines and siege towers. In those hours, my old life tugged at me, reminding me of the decades I had spent avoiding exactly this. I had seen too many wars already, watched too many kingdoms rise and fall. Each time I had sworn that next time I would be further away, tucked into some quiet corner brewing herbal tinctures while humanity rearranged its borders. Yet here I was, walking directly toward the largest conflagration of the age beside a witcher, a bard, and an archer, whose loud opinions concealed a weary tenderness, all for the sake of a girl I had never met, whose existence reached me only through broken accounts and fragmentary dreams. We say we choose our companions rationally, selecting those whose goals align with our own. We still wonder whether, in truth, it is not our hidden needs that recognize one another first, like lanterns answering lanterns across a dark field. War, when you are not in the front rank of a charge, is mostly a matter of distance. How far to the next village? How far behind the last patrol? How far ahead the thunder of hooves? For us, in those first weeks together, war became a series of measured intervals framed by the rise and fall of our small nightly fire. Days blurred into a ritual of movement and pause. At dawn, Milva would already be awake, checking the ground for fresh tracks, listening to the wind with a concentration that made speech feel intrusive. Geralt rose more slowly, testing how much of his pain had agreed to stay behind in the night. Dandelion groaned and wrapped himself tighter in his cloak until someone threatened to tip cold water over him. I prepared what passed for breakfast, which was usually dry bread, a piece of cheese, and the faint hope of something warm later. We passed through places that had once been villages and were now only arrangements of walls and memories. A well choked with ash, a door swinging from a single hinge, a child's wooden toy lying in the road, wheels broken, as if dropped in mid-game by an invisible hand. On good days, there were still people there, wary and half-starved, clutching whatever they had been quick enough to load onto carts. On bad days, there was only silence, pierced now and then by the distant call of crows. My work expanded beyond our small company. It is impossible for a healer to pass through suffering and not stop. I set bones for farmers whose only crime had been living on the wrong side of a line on a map. I drained abscesses for women who had been ignoring them because they had more immediate worries. such as finding enough flour for tomorrow. I cleaned the shallow cuts of boys still trying to decide whether to be afraid. Geralt helped when he could, in his own way. Sometimes that meant lifting something too heavy for other hands without drawing notice to the effort. Sometimes it meant standing near a well or a doorway in that quiet, watchful way of his, until an argument subsided without anyone quite understanding why they had stopped shouting. People who did not know what a witcher was still recognized the aura of a man for whom violence had long ago become a craft. Quite often, that was enough to keep new wounds from forming while I dealt with the old ones. Dandelion, to give him his due, did more than complain. He played in courtyards and barns when asked, sometimes even when he was not asked. His songs, tailored hastily to local pride or grievances, drew smiles from faces that had forgotten the movement. Children stared at his bright clothes as if he were some exotic bird that had lost its flock. For a few minutes at a time, their gaze turned away from empty larders and missing fathers. Milva bartered. She had an instinct for what people needed most and what they had just barely enough of to trade away. A few arrows repaired in exchange for a sack of oats. News about a nearby ford swapped for dried meat. She spoke little and listened much, and in listening gathered a web of small practical truths. Which roads were watched, which bridges had collapsed, where the river ran shallow enough for carts. At our campfires, these fragments were sorted and weighed. War reports arrived in grand style later, from heralds and messengers and official proclamations. We dealt in earlier drafts, written in mud and fear. Refugees from the south insisted that Nilfgaard was unstoppable, that its armies marched like a black tide. Riders from northern levies swore that new alliances were forming, that this time the north had learned its lesson. The picture shifted with every encounter, but one detail remained constant. None of these people had chosen to be where they were. Sometimes, as I stitched a wound by lantern light, I remembered quieter places I had known. An inn kitchen where an argument about soup had been the most urgent problem of the day. A modest town square where tradesmen had fretted over taxes and weather, but never once considered that their houses might vanish overnight. It is strange how the mind reaches back not to moments of triumph, but to trivial evenings when nothing much happened. Our own small company collected such moments without quite realizing it. The night Milva, exasperated by our attempts at cooking, seized the pot and produced a stew that tasted almost like something one might willingly pay for. The way Dandelion sulked until she handed him the spoon and told him to taste his own good fortune. The way Geralt, half asleep, nevertheless rose whenever any of us shifted too quickly. His hand already reaching for a sword, he had not yet fully recovered the strength to swing. I recall one evening in particular, in a hollow by the roadside where the wind passed over our heads instead of through our bones. We had tended to a family that had lost almost everything except a stubborn refusal to move on. Their youngest child had a fever. I left them a small packet of herbs and what advice I could. As we prepared to ride on, the child's sister ran after us and pressed something into Dandelion's hand. It was a ribbon, red once, now faded and frayed. Her only ornament. She told him, fiercely, that he must wear it so that his songs would not be lonely. Dandelion, who could have turned that moment into a performance, accepted it with surprising quiet. He tied it to the neck of his lute. For days afterward, he fingered it absently when he thought no one was watching. The ribbon fluttered when he played, a small, ridiculous banner in a landscape filled with much larger ones. You may have known gestures like that in kinder circumstances. A neighbour sharing the last jar of homemade jam during hard times. A colleague leaving a cup of coffee on your desk without asking what keeps you late. On paper, these acts are insignificant. They do not alter policies or redraw borders. Yet we still wonder whether it is not precisely such small mercies that keep the larger cruelties of the world from grinding us entirely to dust. In the pauses between villages, when the sky stretched wide and empty, Geralt questioned every passer-by who might have heard even a whisper of Ciri. Most had not. A few repeated tales already worn smooth by travel. The girl was in Nilfgaard, or she had joined some band of rebels, or she had vanished into another sphere entirely. Each version bore the marks of wishful thinking. Each left him more tightly coiled. I could not offer him certainty. No one could. What I could offer, and did, were the small rhythms of care. Clean bandages, tinctures that eased his breathing at night, jokes at my own expense when the others grew too solemn. A body that is slightly less tormented can walk a little further, listen a little longer, make one more decision. In a landscape where every extra mile might be the one that brings you to what you seek, that is not nothing. On some level, I suspect, we were all practicing the same fragile art. Milva with her bargains, Dandelion with his songs, Geralt with his stubborn silence, and I with my needles. Each of us tried to push back against the tide of destruction with tools that would have seemed laughable to a general. At night, surrounded by the crackle of the fire and the soft, exhausted breathing of our companions, there were moments when the world felt almost bearable, and when I dared to ask myself whether these small, stubborn kindnesses might yet matter more than the banners under which men marched. It was inevitable that sooner or later we would wander too close to the edges of someone's carefully drawn map. Armies, unlike rumours, do not drift. They carve lines into the land with boots, wheels, and blood. We first felt that pressure on a morning when the mist refused to lift and the road narrowed between patches of scrub too thin to be called forest and too stubborn to be farmland. We heard the riders before we saw them, the faint clink of metal, the uneven rhythm of horses whose gaits had been ruined by too many forced marches. Milva raised her hand, a sharp gesture, and we guided our mounts off the road. It was a reflex with us by then, as natural as breathing. When war approaches, the sensible thing is to become small. A file of northern soldiers came into view, their banner a tired scrap of colour hanging from a pole. Their armour was mismatched, some pieces polished, others rusted, all of it bearing dents that told a more honest story than any speech. These were not the shining knights of Dandelion's more optimistic ballads. They were the kind of men who had forgotten how it felt to wake without the weight of mail on their shoulders. They halted when they saw us. The captain, a narrow-faced man with a permanent squint, rode forward. His eyes moved over Milva and Dandelion without interest, lingered on my bag for a heartbeat, then fixed on Geralt. White hair is difficult to ignore. Cat's eyes are harder still. "A witcher," he said, "on this road, with unknown companions." He did not reach for his sword. He did not need to. The men behind him straightened hands on hilts, bows creaking as strings tightened. The air grew tense in that particular way that makes one suddenly aware of every exposed inch of skin. "We are travelling south," Geralt answered. "We do not serve any banner." The captain's mouth twisted. It was not quite a smile. "Everyone serves a banner," he said. "Some just have not admitted it yet. There is Nilfgaard behind you and the north in front. You cannot walk between us forever, not on this road." He was right. Maps drawn by generals leave little space for those who prefer to stand aside. In such drawings, there are only allies, enemies, and territory. People who insist on being simply people become an inconvenience. I watched Geralt's jaw tighten. Neutrality had long been his shield. Witches, by old custom, avoided politics. They dealt in contracts, not causes. Yet the war had already chewed that shield thin. Ciri's fate was knotted with that of kings and emperors, of secret councils and long-laid plans. Every step we took toward her led deeper into their struggles. "What do you want from us?" Geralt asked. The question was calm, but the hand on his reins had gone still. "The Nilfgaardians are probing our positions," the captain said. "Scouts, raiders, small units testing our reactions. We know they crossed the river 2 days ago. You are going that way, so you will bring back word." "How many? What banners? What strength?" He said it as if it were already decided, as if our choice were merely a formality. In a sense, it was. Refusal would mark us as suspicious. Suspicious travellers on that narrow strip of contested land had a tendency to vanish into ditches. Milva shifted in her saddle. She understood as well as I did that the captain was not offering us a task, but a test. Dandelion opened his mouth, perhaps to protest that artists should be exempt from reconnaissance work, then closed it again when he saw the archers. Geralt did not answer immediately. He looked past the captain at the men standing in the mist, at their muddy boots and chapped hands, at the fatigue that no amount of bravado could conceal. These were not the architects of the war. They were its bricks. "We are not scouts," he said at last. "Today you are," the captain replied, "unless you would prefer to be corpses. There are moments when all the complicated philosophies we weave about freedom and choice collapse into a single unpleasant alternative. Move forward or fall, speak or be silent, help or turn away. We like to imagine that in those moments we will act according to our highest ideals. In practice, we tend to choose survival first and justify it later." Geralt glanced briefly at me. I met his eyes and gave an almost imperceptible shrug. I was not advising him, I was acknowledging the reality we shared. None of us wanted to serve under a banner. All of us wanted to go on breathing. "Very well," he said. "We will look." The captain nodded, as if this were only sensible. He gave us rough directions to a ridge overlooking the river, warned us of possible patrols, and reminded us, with a thin smile, that he would be waiting for our report. As we rode away, Milva muttered something not fit for delicate ears. Dandelion, once out of earshot, launched into a complaint about conscription and the rights of the free individual. Geralt said nothing. The lines around his eyes had deepened. "You could have refused," I observed quietly when the others had ridden ahead. And then, what he said: "Kill our way past them. Draw more soldiers, lose time. Let Ciri drift further beyond reach. Neutrality is a fine posture when you stand alone on a crossroads. It is less useful when both roads are already burning. I thought of that later, when we reached the ridge. From there, we saw the river looping through the landscape like a dark, patient animal. On the far bank moved small clusters of figures, their armour darker, their banners bearing the stylized sun of Nilfgaard. Scouts indeed, feeling along the edges of the north, like fingers probing a wound. We watched in silence, counting, measuring, comparing what we saw with the captain's fears. Milva noted the routes they favoured, the way they avoided certain thickets. Dandelion, notebook in hand, tried to look like a chronicler rather than a terrified man too near a battlefield. Geralt studied their positions with the cold, distant focus of a hunter who recognizes other hunters. When we turned back, the question of what to say awaited us like another patrol. We could soften the truth, delay the captain's decisions, buy a few days of calm for some nameless village downriver. Or we could report accurately, giving him what he needed to prepare an ambush that would almost certainly kill the men we had just watched picking their way through the reeds. There is a particular weariness that comes from realizing that every option before you carries someone's death hidden in its folds. It feels, I imagine, not unlike sitting at a desk stacked with difficult files, each representing a person you will disappoint no matter what you sign. From the outside, it may look like indecision. From the inside, it is the recognition that there are no clean hands left to be had. In the end, Geralt chose precision. He described the Nilfgaardian movements without embellishment or omission. Milva added small, crucial details. The captain listened, brow furrowed, then strode away to bark orders. Men moved. Horses were saddled. Somewhere trumpets would sound before dusk. As we rode away from that camp, Dandelion was quieter than usual. "Do you ever feel," he said at last, "that we are becoming pieces on the same chessboard we swore we would never play?" On Geralt did not answer. Milva told him to stop whining and keep his head down. I considered the question, turning it over like a coin. "We are not pieces," I said. "Pieces move only when touched. We still choose our steps, even if the space left to us is narrower than we would like." That was true in a sense. Yet, as the day thickened and we put more miles between ourselves and the northern camp, I could not entirely shake the image of those two banners. The tired cloth of the north in the mist behind us. The black sun of Nilfgaard glimpsed earlier through river fog. Between them we rode, not quite belonging to either, yet unable to pretend that their clash did not shape our path. We tell ourselves that refusing a banner keeps us free, but we still wonder whether, in a world already divided by other people's choices, it is possible to walk untouched between their lines, or whether every step we take, even in pursuit of our own private quest, inevitably tilts the balance on one side of the board. We noticed him first as an absence. For several days Milva had been uneasy. She said little, but she lengthened our detours, watched the skyline more often, and spent longer examining tracks in the dust. When pressed, she only muttered that the road felt too aware of us, as if someone had drawn a circle around our company and was careful not to step inside it. Tracks confirmed it. A single horse, well shod, following at a respectful distance. Sometimes nearer, sometimes further, but always there. Not the pattern of a patrol sweeping the area. the pattern of someone who had chosen us specifically and meant to keep us in sight. One evening, as the light thinned to a washed-out gold and the air smelled of cold river stones, the pattern broke. We had stopped beside a stand of willows. Dandelion was tuning his lute. Geralt was checking his saddle straps. Milva was pretending not to be nervous. "Enough," she said suddenly. "If he wants to follow, let him introduce himself before I put an arrow where it will interfere with his thoughts." She stepped out from behind the trees, bow already half raised, and called into the twilight with a voice that brooked no argument. "Come out." Slowly, hands visible. "If I have to shout twice, you will come out flatter." There was a pause, long enough for the wind to flutter the leaves and for Dandelion to mutter something about moderation. Then a horse moved in the undergrowth, and a rider emerged onto the road. His armour, unlike that of the soldiers we had recently encountered, was well kept despite the dust. Black, with the faint traces of gold trim dulled by travel. His helm hung from his saddle, revealing a young face that should have belonged to a courtier or a promising squire. Dark hair, strong jaw, eyes shadowed more by memory than by the fading light. On his breastplate, almost rubbed away but still recognizable, was the stylized sun of Nilfgaard. Milva's bowstring tightened. "A long way from your Emperor's shadow, horseman," she said. "State your business before I decide we've heard enough." The rider dismounted slowly, palms open. He did not reach for his sword. He did not look away, either. His gaze went past Milva, past me and Dandelion, and settled on Geralt. "I have been trying to catch up with you," he said, "for some time." His voice betrayed an accent not of the north, though he spoke our tongue fluently. There was formality in it, the stiffness of someone accustomed to delivering reports and orders, rather than pleas. Geralt regarded him without expression. If he recognized the man at once, he gave no sign. And why, the Witcher said, would a Nilfgaardian officer wish to travel in the company of those who do not serve his emperor? The rider stiffened slightly at the title. "I am not an officer," he answered. "Not any more. My name is Cahir." The name fell like a stone into a still pond. I saw the ripple run through Dandelion first. His mouth opened in disbelief, then snapped shut as if the air had stolen his words. Milva's eyes narrowed to slits. Cahir. I knew the name only from the edges of rumours. A man in a black winged helmet who had pursued Ciri through dreams and waking. An imperial hound set upon the trail of a frightened child. Some called him a captor, others a nightmare given human shape. Milva's voice acquired an edge sharp enough to cut stone. "You," she said, "the one in her nightmares, the one who hunted her at Sintra, at the river, at the feast. You dare follow us." Dandelion found his tongue. "Geralt," he hissed. "That is the man, the one she kept seeing, the Black Rider. He is—" "Yes," Cahir said quietly. "I am that man." The admission hung in the air like smoke. He did not raise his hands further in defence, did not step backward when Milva's bow tilted higher. He looked at Geralt as if the Witcher's judgment were the only one that truly mattered. "I was a fool," he went on. "I was young and eager to distinguish myself. I believed what I was told, that the girl was a key to ending the war, that bringing her to the Emperors would save the continent from worse. I saw only duty, not the child behind it. I have paid for that blindness. I am still paying." There was a tremor in his voice now, the crack of strain in a structure pushed too far. His hands, however, remained steady. "You expect us to believe that you have changed?" Milva said. "Because your conscience has grown inconvenient." "No," he answered. "I expect nothing from you. I followed because I heard what you were doing. I heard that Geralt of Rivia was seeking the girl, that he meant to find her, not for a throne or a prophecy, but for her own sake. I know the routes she was taken, the orders that were given, the men who obeyed them. I thought," he hesitated, searching for words that would not sound like excuses, "I thought that if I helped you find her, it might count for something." Geralt's expression did not soften. "Count for whom?" he asked. "For her, for you, for your emperor, for myself," Cahir said. "I do not ask for forgiveness. I do not deserve it. I ask for a chance to do something other than obey bad commands. It is easy, from a safe distance, to know exactly what one should do in such situations. Turn him away, strike him down, trust him without question. All these options feel clean in imagination. In practice, they are not. Not when you have looked too often into the eyes of people who no longer know how to undo what they have done." Milva wanted to refuse him outright. Her voice said as much. Dandelion, ever more attuned to stories, saw the dramatic possibilities in letting a former hunter join the hunted. His fear and curiosity wrestled openly. I watched Cahir's hands, his shoulders, the set of his jaw. A man rehearsing a lie carries tension in certain places, the flicker of the gaze, the restless fingers, the ready anger. Cahir's stillness was not that of a confident deceiver. It was the stillness of someone who has stripped himself of everything but a single stubborn intention, and stands waiting to see whether it will be enough. "Why should I not kill you now?" Geralt said at last. "Because it would change nothing for her," Cahir replied. "And you are a man who acts for her, not for yourself." Silence stretched between them. The wind rustled the willow leaves. Somewhere a bird protested being disturbed. Finally, Geralt looked away, toward the south, where the sky darkened over lands we had yet to cross. "If you ride with us," he said, "you obey our decisions, not your emperor's. You speak when asked. You do not vanish in the night to report to anyone. The first sign that you are leading us into a trap, and I will finish what your nightmares began." "I understand," Cahir said. Milva lowered her bow only a fraction. "I do not," she muttered. "But you will find that out if you disappoint us." Dandelion exhaled with theatrical relief, then immediately began worrying about the poetic merits of their new companion's name. It was his way of coping with a knot that no song could truly untie. As for me, I noted the shape our little company was taking. Witcher, bard, archer, vampire passing for barber-surgeon, and now a former Nilfgaardian pursuer of the very girl we sought. Most armies issue uniforms to create unity. Fate, it seemed, preferred to clothe its strangest battalions in contradictions. That night, as we shared a fire made smaller than usual in case of scouts, Cahir sat slightly apart, not far enough to be dramatic, but far enough to mark the distance between us. Milva ignored him with great determination. Dandelion alternated between asking intrusive questions and inventing elaborate backstories for him. I brought Kahir a bowl of thin stew. He accepted it with a nod and ate slowly, as if the act itself were unfamiliar. After a time, he spoke softly, not looking up. She called me the Black Rider, he said. In her dreams, I did not know. I thought I was only a man doing a job. He let out a breath that sounded halfway to a laugh, yet contained nothing of amusement. How strange to discover that in someone else's story you have always been the monster. I considered him, this young man who had once ridden in shining armor for an empire, and now hunched over our shared pot like any other exile. We rarely get to choose how we appear in other people's memories, I said. All we can do is decide what we will do with the knowledge, once we finally hear their version. He nodded, staring into the fire. The light carved new lines in his face, tracing a road from pride to something like humility. We like to believe that our past actions define us completely, either damning or sanctifying us beyond appeal. It is a tempting simplicity, yet we still wonder whether the true measure of a person lies not only in what they have done, but in what they are willing to do once they finally see themselves through the eyes of those they have harmed. Night, more than battle, reveals who we truly are. By day, we wore the faces the road required. Milva, the sharp-eyed scout, Geralt, the silent hunter, Dandelion, the tireless jester, Kahir, the stiff-backed exile, and I, the unremarkable healer. The sun bleached our differences until we were simply 5 figures moving through dust. After dark, when the fire had burned down to a steady glow and the sky unrolled its map of indifferent stars, those masks loosened. Fatigue does to the soul what wine does to the tongue. It makes pretense heavy and honesty comparatively light. We had found shelter that night in the hollow of a ruined wayside shrine. Once travellers had left offerings there, a coin for luck, a sprig of herbs for safe passage. Now only the stone base remained, its idol broken, its alcoves empty. We made our fire where prayers had once been whispered, a detail Dandelion found both tragic and inspiring. "Look at us," he said, poking the embers with a stick. "A witcher, a hunter, a runaway Nilfgaardian, a suspicious woman who despises everyone equally, and a barber who knows far too much about everything. If some future chronicler does not make us into legends, I shall be deeply offended." Milva snorted. "If anyone writes about us," she said, "it will be in the margin of someone else's story." A few wanderers passed through. They left muddy footprints. That is all. Dandelion clutched his chest, wounded. "You underestimate my talent. I can find tragedy in a misplaced potato. Give me a few doomed wanderers, and I will give the world an epic." Geralt, who had been sharpening his sword with slow, economical strokes, looked up. "And how would you begin this epic?" he asked. "With Cintra, of course," Dandelion said. "With flames and falling towers, and a girl on a horse at the edge of the world." Kahir flinched. It was a small movement, but in the close circle of firelight, nothing small went unnoticed. The stick in his hand snapped. Milva's eyes flicked to him, narrow and alert. "You were there," she said, "at Cintra." He stared into the fire for a long moment, jaw clenched. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than I had yet heard it. "Yes," he said, "I was there." He did not launch into defense. There were no protestations of obedience, no speeches about duty. Instead, he began with something apparently trivial: the smell. "Everyone talks about the noise," he said. "The clash of steel, the screaming. They think war is sound. But that night, what I remember most is the smell of wet stone and horse sweat and poultices. We had been awake too long. My eyes felt lined with sand. I wanted it to be over. Not for victory, for sleep." He talked then, haltingly at first, of orders shouted down echoing corridors, of racing through streets choked with smoke, of glimpsing a little girl in a nightgown, only for her to vanish into the chaos. He admitted that she had been, to him then, not Ciri, but an objective, a way to prove himself to distant superiors who would read his report over wine and decide if his name deserved promotion. "I thought," he said, "that if I could just complete the task, all of this would make sense. The fire, the fear, the dead, they would be the price of a necessary act. When she slipped away from me again and again, it felt like failure, not mercy. I did not see her as a child, only as a point on a map I could not pin down." His hands tightened on what remained of the stick until it splintered further. "When I learned later what she had dreamed," he went on, "how she saw me in that helmet, how I rode after her even in her sleep, I realized that I had not been a man doing a job. I had been the shape of terror itself, an animal of the dark she could not outrun." He fell silent. The fire crackled softly. Somewhere in the ruins, a mouse ventured out and thought better of it. "You stopped," Milva said at last. Her tone was still hard, but something in it had shifted. "Stopped serving them, stopped hunting her." "Yes," he replied, "far later than I should have. But yes." Dandelion, perhaps sensing that we stood on a cliff edge of grimness, rushed to fill the quiet with humour. He launched into a tale of his first disastrous performance at a prince's wedding, where a misplaced rhyme had nearly cost him his ears. He exaggerated, of course, turning minor embarrassment into near execution. Yet, beneath the flourishes, I heard a real story. A young man discovering that words, once loosed, cannot always be called back. "I learned that night," he concluded grandly, "that a song is a blade without a scabbard. You must live with where you swing it." Geralt raised an eyebrow. "And have you?" "More or less," Dandelion said. "I still miss the scabbard." Even Milva's mouth twitched. The tension eased a little, like a rope loosening. It was then, perhaps inevitably, that attention turned to me. People are suspicious of listeners who share too little. "You know all our sins," Milva said. "More than we intended to tell, I'd wager." "What about yours, Barber?" I had expected the question eventually. I had not decided in advance how I would answer it. For a time I had hoped that silence would suffice, that I could continue to mend flesh and pour draughts without ever revealing what else my hands had done, what else they could still do. But the road, like the night, has its own gravity. Secrets carried too long become heavier than truth. "You already know that I am not exactly what I pretend to be," I said. Dandelion waved a hand. "You are too educated for a simple barber. Yes, yes. I have suspected a scandalous noble background, perhaps a stint in a university before a tragic love affair. I am a higher vampire," I said. The words landed with a simplicity that made their content all the more striking. For a heartbeat, even the fire seemed to pause. Milva's hand went instinctively toward her bow. Cahir shifted, weight dropping toward the balls of his feet, eyes scanning for exits. Dandelion's mouth opened in a perfect circle of horror and fascination. Geralt, who had clearly suspected as much for some time, merely exhaled. "A higher vampire," he said. "Not the easiest thing to kill. Not that many have ever managed it." "Some have tried," I answered. "Once they succeeded. Locally." Curiosity battled with caution on their faces. I spared them the more vivid details. YouTube policies on tasteful narration did not concern me, of course, but the human mind can do enough damage with suggestion alone. Suffice it to say, I told them, that there was a night long ago when I had overindulged. Blood, for my kind, can become what strong drink is for humans. A refuge, a thrill, an oblivion. I had taken too much, too often, from people who could not afford the loss. They had discovered what stalked them. They had acted with a collective fury that tore my body apart. I awoke, I said, a long time later. Reformed as we do, it is a slow process. When you have to rebuild yourself cell by cell in the dark, you have ample opportunity to consider the architecture of your life. I spoke of lying in a shallow grave, feeling each fragment of myself seeking the others, like shards of glass drawn together. Of the clarity that comes when one realizes that even death has refused you, that you must live with what you have done rather than escape it. Humans speak of hitting bottom, I said. For me, bottom was scattered. I had enjoyed my pleasures, you see. I had told myself that those I fed on were insignificant, that I was entitled, that it was my nature. Many alcoholics and gamblers, I suspect, tell themselves something similar. Only when the tavern closes, the friends vanish, the debts come due, does the story sound different. I described in brief the slow years that followed, how I denied myself what I craved, shaking like any addict, how I learned to endure the ache rather than soothe it with harm, how I discovered that there are other intoxications, the gratitude of a healed patient, the quiet of a well-ordered workshop, the relief of walking through a town and knowing that no one there had reason to fear the night because of me. So now I finished. I drink no alcohol and no blood. I cut hair. I set bones. I listen. It is a modest existence, but it is mine. Chosen rather than merely drifted into. That is why I watch you all so closely. I recognize in each of you the same struggle, not to become what the world insists you must be. They were silent for a time. Two logs shifted in the fire with a soft sigh. Above us, the stars continued their indifferent vigil. At last, Dandelion spoke, because, of course, he did. "So you are saying," he ventured, "that you were once a murderous fiend, tore people apart, died, came back, and decided to open a barber shop." "More or less," I said. He stared at me, then began to laugh. It was not mocking, but bright, almost incredulous. "Oh, this will make an extraordinary verse," he said. "I shall have to tone it down. No one will believe the full version." Milva did not laugh, but her hand had left her bow. "If you had wanted to kill us," she said, "you have had a dozen chances already." "More," I corrected gently. Cahir shook his head, as if adjusting his sense of proportion. "And I thought I carried the worst burden around this fire," he murmured. Geralt met my gaze over the flames. There was no fear in his eyes, only an old, tired understanding. Witches and monsters have long shared the same borderlands. We are all, he said, trying not to be what we were trained or born to be. We lay down to sleep eventually, each wrapped in our own thoughts. The ruined shrine around us, once devoted to some forgotten deity, now held a very different kind of worship. A small circle of fragile resolutions, offered up not to gods, but to our own, stubborn better selves. We like to insist that people never truly change, that a monster remains a monster, that a coward will always run, that a drunk will always return to the bottle. It is a comfortable belief. It absolves us from expecting more, from ourselves or anyone else. Yet we still wonder whether the quiet promises made under such shared starlight, between those who know one another's worst truths and choose to walk together anyway, might be among the few real miracles this world has left. If nights revealed who we were, the next stretch of road showed us who else the war had made, of everyone else. Not heroes and villains, as songs would have it, but traders in a new and brutal marketplace where the only real currency was survival. We heard the dwarves before we saw them. The road curved between low hills, and from beyond the bend came a racket of clanking metal, hoarse singing, and inventive swearing. Milva slowed, hand to her bow. Dandelion brightened at once, as if someone had rung a tavern bell inside his head. "Dwarves," he said, "if that is not the sound of a dwarven caravan fixing a broken axle while arguing about who broke it, I shall eat my hat." "You do not have a hat," Milva muttered. "Then I shall buy one from them," he replied, "and eat it." We rounded the curve and found the source of the commotion. A stout wagon lay at an angle across the road, one wheel off and propped on a rock. Around it clustered half a dozen dwarves, short, broad, beards braided or loose, every one of them armed as if they expected the road itself to attack them. Tools and weapons jingled together at their belts, making them sound like travelling armories. At the centre stood one with a nose that had met more fists than was healthy, and a beard plaited with small metal tokens. He held a hammer in one hand and an iron tire in the other, and was explaining to the wheel in colourful terms exactly how little he thought of its craftsmanship. When he saw us, his eyes narrowed. Dwarven gazes are like whetstones, they scrape away pretense. "Well, now," he said, "if it isn't a witcher, a bard, a girl with a bow who looks like she could nail a flea at 50 paces, and two fellows I don't recognize but don't yet dislike. Road's getting crowded. Zoltan," Geralt said by way of greeting. "Geralt," the dwarf replied, setting down the hammer. "Thought the rumour of you limping around these parts was just that. Rumour. Yet here you are, uglier than ever, and twice as stubborn, I'll wager." Introductions followed. Zoltan Shivet, dwarf of Mahakam, occasional soldier, current leader of this particular band. His companions, Yarpen-like figures with names that collided in my memory like pebbles in a stream. They carried the look of those who had marched under many banners and trusted none. He eyed me up and down. "And this tall drink of water Regis," I said. "Barber surgeon." "A barber," he repeated. "Useful. Men always need hair-cutting and holes-plugging, especially in times like these. And the young noble in the Nilfgaardian armour." "Former Nilfgaardian," Cahir corrected, jaw tightening. "Former, current, future. Who can tell? Zoltan said cheerfully. War's a river. Men fall in and crawl out on whichever bank will have them. Dandelion obtained, in very short order, both a hug that nearly crushed his ribs, and a loud complaint about having failed to pay back some long-forgotten card debt. Turkaz. Within minutes he was spinning tales, half of them true, while Zoltan interrupted with objections, insults, and occasional corrections that made the stories better. Their wagon contained, among other things, bolts of cloth, tools, a barrel or two of something Zoltan referred to as medicine, and a small stash of weapons they were transporting for friends. Whether those friends were on the same side as the soldiers we had recently aided was a question Zoltan saw no need to clarify. We go where the pay is honest and the food edible, he said cheerfully. Two increasingly rare conditions, mind you. These days a dwarf has to take what work he can get, long as it doesn't stink too badly. Work like what Milva asked. Escort caravans, mostly, Zoltan replied. Sometimes we help a unit hold a ford. Sometimes we help another unit take it back. I don't ask too many questions. Questions make you enemies faster than swords do. Geralt frowned. And the people caught in the middle. Zoltan shrugged, a small, helpless movement that did not sit easily with his usual bravado. They're caught whether I'm here or not, he said. If I can get a few of them across a bridge before it blows, if I can scare off a band of looters, that's something. Meanwhile, my lads eat, and I keep them from signing up with commanders who'll throw them away. It's not pretty, Whitey, but it's the best balance I've found. Later, when the wheel had been fixed and the wagon once again creaked into motion, we found ourselves travelling together. War loves company, especially company that knows how to handle a crossbow. In the evenings, their camp changed the flavour of our fire. There was more noise, more laughter, more arguments about whether Mahakam Ale could truly be improved by adding wild herbs. Dandelion lost money at dice with heroic consistency and accused the dwarves of cheating with equal consistency. They replied that if he could not count to 3 without forgetting which pockets his coins were in, that was hardly their fault. Milva pretended to be above it all, yet I saw her watching the dwarves banter with a faintly wistful expression. Their camaraderie was rough, full of insults and jostling, but under it lay a solid, unquestioned loyalty. They had fought together, starved together, survived together. No one there had to prove their worth anew each morning. One night, as Zoltan scraped his pipe and I checked my instruments, he leaned closer. "You're not just a barber, are you?" he said quietly. "Few of us are just what we appear," I replied. He studied me for a long moment, then nodded as if confirming a suspicion he preferred not to voice. "Well," he said, "you patch my lads up when they get themselves into trouble. I won't ask what else you're capable of. Man's entitled to keep a pocket or two sewn shut." Our path brought us eventually to a crossroads tavern where other people's wars were being traded by the drink. Inside, mercenaries clustered around tables. Men and a few women wearing bits of armour from every army on the map. They laughed too loud, drank too hard, and watched the door with the reflexive mistrust of those who know that death has many disguises. Zoltan hailed a tall, gaunt man with a scar down his cheek and a captain's ease in the way he occupied space. "Pangrat," he called. "Didn't expect to see you this far north without someone's banner flapping above your head." Adam Pangrat, leader of the famed Reavers, gave us a nod that encompassed the room and its potential threats in a single sweep. "Banners come and go," he said. "Coin is more consistent. For now, the North pays. If they stop, we move. War's a market like any other." He spoke of contracts taken and refused, of fortresses besieged for one king and defended for his enemy a season later. There was no bitterness in his tone, only a worn practicality. "You play at neutrality, Witcher," he said to Geralt after a while. "You say you serve no banner. But here you are, moving where the war moves, saving this village, harming that patrol. Whether you wish it or not. Difference between us is that I admit I'm in the trade." Geralt's jaw tightened, but he did not rise to the bait. "My trade is killing monsters," he said. Pangrat smiled thinly. "Then you're busier than any of us," he replied. "Monsters are thick on the ground these days. Not all of them have claws." The tavern's air grew heavier with smoke and unasked questions. Dandelion excused himself to flirt with a serving girl and returned shortly, face flushed, claiming to have secured priceless intelligence about the quality of the stew. Milva rolled her eyes. Cahir sat very straight, listening, realizing perhaps that men like Pangrat had fought for and against the empire he had once served, and would continue fighting long after emperors changed. On the road afterwards, the dwarf company peeled away toward work they had taken, guarding a convoy. Pangrat and his reavers rode east in search of their own contract. We continued southward, still following thinner and thinner threads of news about Ciri. Our little group felt strangely quieter after the dwarves' departure. The road seemed wider, the silences longer, yet something of their rough humanity lingered. A song Dandelion had picked up from them stuck in Milva's humming. Zoltan's blunt assessments echoed in Geralt's brief comments about commanders and their strategies. Even Cahir, so careful with his posture, seemed less rigid after trading a few insults with people who did not care about his past rank. That night, as we made camp without the extra clutter of dwarven packs and barrels, I thought about the men and dwarves we had just left. To them, war was a profession. They took contracts, hardened their hearts where necessary, and measured success not by banners planted but by who among their own still lived. When the smoke cleared. It is tempting to judge such pragmatism from a distance, to declare ourselves morally superior because we suffer nobly rather than adapt. Yet when cold, hunger and fear press in, most lofty ideals begin to look fragile. We tell ourselves we would never fight for pay, never switch sides, never treat war as a business. We still wonder whether, placed in the same relentless furnace, we would truly hold to that, or whether we too would learn to speak of battles as transactions simply to bear the weight of surviving them. The closer we rode toward the main fronts, the more the air itself seemed to change. It grew thicker, as if heavy with unspoken orders, with the breath of thousands of men quietly rehearsing in fear and bravado what they would do when steel finally met steel. Even the birds flew differently, wheeling high and wide, avoiding the invisible lines that generals had scratched across the land. At first, we saw only traces, ruts in the road not made by farm carts but by artillery, fields flattened where tents had stood in strict rows, cook fires reduced to grey circles, the ground around them scarred by the restless pacing of sentries. We would arrive at some hamlet and find it half devoured, Wells fouled, barns emptied, fences hacked apart for fuel. The army was never there when we rode in, but it had left its teeth marks on everything it touched. Then we began to meet the overflow of those same armies. The ones pushed back, peeled away, discarded at the edges. A file of limping men, uniforms torn, bandages soaked and badly tied. A wagon of wounded groaning under a single exhausted driver. A priest who had lost his unit and carried only a book with its pages torn out for makeshift prayers. My work doubled, then doubled again. I was no longer treating the occasional accident of the road. I was running, in effect, a moving clinic on the margins of a great grinding machine. Everywhere we halted, someone needed stitching, draining, splinting. News, like infection, travelled with them. Nilfgaard was pushing here. The North was rallying there. This commander had fallen. That one had betrayed someone or been betrayed. For Geralt, each new report was not an abstract shift of painted blocks on a map. It was a fresh possible path to Ciri, or another door slamming shut. Rumours placed her near Nilfgaardian supply columns with northern guerrillas, in the custody of mages, or already beyond the reach of ordinary roads. None of them were reliable. All of them felt urgent. We skirted what major engagements we could. War, after all, is loud enough without our help. But the land was narrowing. The spaces between armies shrank the way breathing space does in a crowded room. One evening we rode toward a low ridge merely because it offered a vantage point from which Milva might study the country ahead. We found it occupied. From its crest we looked down into a broad valley where a northern host had gathered. Banners snapped in the wind, their colours dulled by distance, but still proud. Ranks of men and dwarves and a few elves formed and reformed under shouted orders. A living pattern shifting on the grass. Across a narrow river, dark knots of Nilfgaardian troops glinted. Between them, empty space waited like held breath. We should have ridden away at once. Instead, we lingered, caught by the spectacle. Even those who despise war find themselves staring when its full enormity gathers, the way one stares at a storm rolling in across the sea. Terrible, but hard to look away from. Dandelion, for once, had no clever comment ready. Milva's face was set, eyes flicking over lines and flanks, already calculating where the killing would be worst. Cahir watched with the peculiar stillness of one who has stood on both sides of such formations, and now trusts neither. "They will clash at dawn," he said quietly, or just before. "The North will hope to surprise. Nilfgaard will count on that and prepare its own surprise in turn." Geralt's gaze did not rest on the banners. It sought the gaps, the wagon trains at the rear, the roads leading out toward villages whose names only their inhabitants knew. "We will not be here when they charge," he said. "We gain nothing by watching boys die for speeches made far away." Yet we did not leave immediately. The northern commanders, short on medics and long on casualties, had learned to see the value of anyone with clean bandages and a steady hand. Within the hour, someone had noticed my instruments. Within 2, I had been directed to a long canvas tent that smelled of fear and carbolic acid, and given more work than one pair of hands could reasonably perform before dawn. I could have refused. We could have ridden away under cover of the gathering dark. Our quest, after all, was not for this army. It was for a single girl somewhere beyond this valley. But the wounded were already arriving, men with eyes wide and bright from the first taste of real combat, others with the dull stare of those who had lived through too many such days. The battle had not yet officially begun, yet skirmishes and probing attacks had already laid their claim. I could no more turn away from them than a moth from a flame. The difference was that I knew I would burn and walked in anyway. Milva and even Dandelion helped as they could, fetching water, holding lamps, steadying limbs. Kahir, with the efficient calm of someone accustomed to battle preparations, organized the line of those waiting, keeping panic from tipping into chaos. Geralt stood by the tent flap, intercepting those whose injuries were better served by a quick bandage and a stern word than by taking up our limited space. As the hours bled toward dawn, the camp settled into the brittle quiet that comes before catastrophe. Somewhere out in the grey, officers walked the lines, offering last instructions that half their men would not remember. A cook stirred a pot he knew would be wasted. A messenger checked his saddle girth one more time, because it was something he could control. Inside our canvas world, I stitched and cut and tied, wrapping human flesh back into its leaking envelopes, knowing full well that many of those I sent out with a pat on the shoulder would be back before noon in a state no healer could mend. My fingers moved confidently. My heart did not. Geralt came to me once, just before the sky began to pale. When the first horn sound, he said, "We leave." "There will be more wounded then," I replied. "There will always be more wounded," he answered. "If we stay for every last one, we will never move again. Ciri is not in this camp. She may be in the ruins these men will leave behind. That is where we must be." It was a brutal arithmetic. Save these few more, lose that distant one. Save that one, abandon these. There was no equation in which all lives emerged intact. We spoke quietly, like two clerks arguing over a ledger that refused to balance. In gentler lives, you may know softer versions of this calculation. Stay late to help a colleague and miss an evening at home. Take a better job in another city and leave behind neighbors who relied on you. There is no villain in such choices. Yet someone always goes without. The horns did sound at last, a long rising note that trembled in the canvas and bones alike. A second, answering from the far side of the valley. The men who could still fight formed up. The ones who could not lay still and tried not to listen. We stepped out into a dawn smeared with low cloud. The northern army began to move, a great, clumsy beast shaking itself awake. Standard-bearers advanced, followed by infantry, by cavalry whose horses knew too well what such formations meant. Across the river, Nilfgaard's dark blocks answered in kind. We did not wait to see the collision. Our horses were ready. Packs were secured. Milva led us along a side track that curved around the valley's lip, using the folds of the land as cover. Dandelion looked back once, his face pale. Kahir did not look back at all. As we rode, the first roar reached us, the sound of thousands of throats, of steel on shields, of the future closing around those trapped between banners. Geralt did not spur his horse, but he did not slow either. His gaze was fixed on the southern horizon, where the smoke of other, smaller fires marked the track of armies, and perhaps, somewhere beyond them, the path of a thin girl, with ash-coloured hair. We tell ourselves that great battles are the hinges on which history turns, and perhaps that is partly true. Yet, as the thunder of that distant clash followed us down the road, I could not help but wonder whether, for those of us who walk the edges, it is the choices made just outside the field of glory that truly shape our lives, the roads we take to avoid the fighting, the hands we lift or lower when another calls for help, the moment we decide to turn our backs on a valley of banners in order to search for a single lost child. We reached the bridge near dusk, at that hour when colours drain from the world, and everything looks as if it is already remembering itself in hindsight. From a distance, it could have been any river crossing, a strip of stone thrown over dark water, a cluster of houses on either bank, a mill wheel turning lazily in the current. Closer, the war revealed itself. The road leading to the bridge was churned into a smear of mud and hoofprints. Abandoned carts leaned at crooked angles, their loads either looted or hastily unloaded. On the northern bank, a handful of soldiers worked with the desperate focus of those who know they are late. Some dragged barrels toward the parapet. Others piled sacks and broken furniture into makeshift barricades. A banner hung from a pole above them, its colours tattered and damp. "Too few," Milva said under her breath. She was right. Perhaps 30 men and women in mismatched armour, the remnants of a larger unit. Their commander, identified by the tarnished decoration on his breastplate rather than by any air of command, limped from group to group, barking orders that sounded more like pleas. He saw us and straightened as much as his injured leg allowed. His gaze flicked over Geralt and lingered on the swords. It lingered on my medical bag. It hesitated a moment on Cahir's armour, then chose to ignore it. "The bridge will be attacked," he said without preamble. "Their vanguard is close. We have to hold long enough to get the civilians across and the far bank cleared." After that, he let the sentence trail off into the river mist. After that, the bridge might stand or fall. After that, his little band might survive or not. He had narrowed his world to the next hour, because anything beyond that was too heavy to carry. Geralt looked past him toward the southern bank. Shadowy figures moved among the trees, too disciplined to be looters. Nilfgaardian scouts testing the range, counting defenders. He watched them the way a hunter watches wolves circling a flock. "How long until they are ready to attack?" he asked. "Soon," the commander said. "An hour, perhaps less. They have cavalry, some infantry, a few light engines. We have this bridge and stubbornness. I would prefer an additional 100 men, but the quartermaster misplaced them." It was a weak joke, brittle with strain. Dandelion actually laughed, a short, startled sound, as if to prove that humour still had a place in the world. Geralt's gaze moved along the bridge itself. It was narrow, with low stone walls suited more to keeping drunk carters from tumbling into the water than to stopping arrows. The current below was swift, swollen by recent rains. Not an easy ford. "We can help," Geralt said. No one had asked. The decision seemed to surprise even him as it left his mouth. Until that moment, we had been observers threading between other people's heroic stands. Now, for reasons perhaps even he could not fully articulate, he stepped forward. "You will be needed," the commander replied. "We cannot hold the crossing alone. We need someone at the centre, someone the others will follow when it begins." He said it without flattery. He had seen enough men to know the difference between swagger and weight. Geralt, for all his ragged state, carried the latter. Orders spread quickly in that small, strained camp. Civilians were hurried to the far bank, old men with bundles, women dragging children by the hand. A miller carrying his ledger balanced absurdly on top of a sack of flour. The bridge became a funnel for their fear. Our horses were led to a sheltered hollow. Milva took her place near the low wall with a clear view of the southern approach. Dandelion stayed close to the non-combatants, guiding them with uncharacteristic efficiency. Cahir joined the thin line of defenders, his Nilfgaardian plate now a strange emblem on the northern side. Some soldiers eyed him with suspicion, but the press of work left little room for argument. A man in armour who knew how to hold a shield was an asset, regardless of past allegiances. I established a small station at the northern end of the bridge, laying out cloths, needles, salves. It was a poor imitation of a real field hospital, but it would have to serve. The first arrows came as darkness thickened. A testing volley from the trees on the southern bank, more to measure our reaction than to kill. Men ducked. Milva did not. Her bow sang in answer, and one of the shadowy figures collapsed. After that, the real attack began. Light engines were rolled into position on the far side, their silhouettes like ungainly insects against the dim sky. Rocks arced overhead, not enough to shatter the bridge, but enough to crush ribs and courage. Infantry emerged from the cover of the trees, shields raised, advancing in disciplined lines toward the foot of the crossing. Behind them, cavalry gathered, waiting for the moment when our defence would stumble. Geralt took his place at the centre of the bridge. The defenders clustered around him, drawn as much by instinct as by command. His swords were bare, his stance balanced. That strange, patient stillness about him which precedes sudden motion. He did not shout speeches. He did not promise victory. He simply lifted one blade and said, in that level tone of his, that no one was to yield a single step unless there was another step ready behind it. And then the river crossing became a narrow, screaming corridor of will against momentum. I will not recount each clash. Steel met steel, shields splintered. Men fell and were dragged back or left where they lay. The enemy pressed forward, spurred less by hatred than by the relentless logic of orders. Our small band yielded inches, then reclaimed them. Milva's arrows struck shields, helmets, gaps in armour. Dandelion shuttled between fleeing civilians and my crude station, his doublet stained with mud and something darker. Cahir fought with a cold precision that contrasted with the chaos around him, covering gaps with the reflex of someone who had once practiced drills under a very different banner. From my position at the bridgehead, I worked in a blur of red soaked cloth and sharp commands. Bandages wrapped, wounds bound. Those who could no longer stand were pushed gently but firmly aside to clear space for the living. Those who insisted on returning to the fight sometimes did so with their faces still pale from blood loss. It was during one of the heavier pushes, when Nilfgaardian infantry surged up the centre and our line buckled, that the fire truly came. A flaming projectile, poorly aimed or blessed by chance, struck a small storehouse near the northern end of the bridge. Dry wood caught at once. Flames leapt, casting wild light over the combat. Smoke rolled across the parapet, thick and choking. For a moment, defenders coughed and blinked, half blind. The enemy saw their chance. Another surge, harder this time. Our front rank faltered. A gap opened. Geralt moved to fill it, blade singing, but even he could not be two men at once. A Nilfgaardian soldier slipped past him, sword raised, heading not for the Witcher, but for the cluster of civilians still struggling to clear the bridgehead. Time does strange things in such moments. It stretches, thins, becomes a series of distinct instants. I heard Dandelion shout. I saw Milva turn, too far away for an arrow. I saw the soldier's sword begin to descend toward a woman trying to shield a child with her own body. And then I was there. One heartbeat, I stood beside my makeshift table, fingers stiff with cold and work. The next, I had crossed the length of the bridgehead, faster than any human sprint could carry me. Hand closing around the soldier's wrist with a force that jarred the bones in his forearm. His eyes widened. Surprise, then fear. I twisted. The sword clanged to the stones. I pushed him back, away from the woman, away from the child, away from the line. A little too hard. He flew backward as if struck by a siege engine, crashing into his own comrades. For an instant, everything near me paused. Cahir stared. Milva's mouth opened, then shut. The woman clutched her child and scrambled away. Geralt, further along the bridge, had seen only a blur, a disturbance in the rhythm of the fight. He would ask questions later. The moment broke. The flow of battle resumed, like a river reclaiming a stone. I stepped back into my role, heart pounding with an old, half-remembered hunger that I crushed down with long-practiced force. You might expect a rush of exhilaration at such a display, perhaps even from someone who has spent so long denying his nature. There was none. Only a heavy awareness that a line I had drawn for myself had been crossed, however briefly. The fire near the storehouse continued to crackle. Men coughed in the smoke, eyes streaming. Geralt rallied the defenders, turning the enemy's overextension against them in a series of swift counterstrikes. Milva's arrows found new targets outlined in orange glare. Cahir planted himself where the line was thinnest and refused to move. Eventually, slowly, the pressure eased. Nilfgaardian officers, realizing that the crossing would cost more than it was worth, began to pull their troops back. The engines fell silent. The dark shapes receded into the trees. The river's natural murmur returned, tentative at first, as if surprised to be heard. We stood on the bridge among the fallen, our breaths making small clouds in the smoky air. The banner above us hung limp. The commander with the injured leg limped along the line, counting, his lips moving silently. He did not cheer, neither did anyone else. Holding a bridge is rarely a triumph. It is a reprieve. Geralt walked back toward the northern end, sword tip trailing. He stopped near me and glanced briefly at the scorched storehouse, at the shaken civilians, at the soldier still groaning where I had flung him into his own ranks. "You moved fast," he said quietly. "I was motivated," I answered. Our eyes met. In his, there was no accusation, only a recognition that asked for no further explanation. He had fought monsters too long to be surprised when one chose, for once, to stand with the prey instead of the pack. We spent the rest of the night tending wounds and damping the last embers. By dawn, the bridge still stood. The commander could continue his retreat with those left to him. We could move on. As we saddled our horses, Dandelion tried to find words suitable for what had happened. The heroism, the flames, the sharp line between those who charged and those who ran. "Baptism of fire," he murmured at last. "One could call it that." Milva shrugged. "Call it what you like," she said. "It will still burn." We rode away with smoke in our clothes and the echo of the clash in our ears. The river shrank behind us. The road stretched ahead, leading toward other dangers, other decisions. We like to imagine that such trials arrive with warning, with trumpets and banners, giving us time to prepare our finest selves. Yet we still wonder whether our truest baptisms by fire come instead in sudden flashes, on narrow bridges and in cramped rooms, when there is no time to consult ideals, and only the instinct of the moment decides who we will be and what we will allow ourselves to do when the flames finally touch us. By morning, the smoke from the bridge had thinned into a grey veil trailing along the river. We wore it in our hair and clothes like a scent we could not wash off. The defenders we left behind had no luxury of reflection. They were already arguing about how many planks to strip from nearby farmsteads to reinforce the parapet, how many men could be spared to escort the wounded north. We rode south. The land beyond the bridge felt strangely muted, as if the noise of the night before had stunned it into cautious silence. Fields lay flattened under the passage of troops. A roadside shrine had toppled, its small stone figure lying face down in the grass. We passed a patch of churned earth where something large had burned, leaving only a black scar surrounded by fragments of charred wood. Dandelion tried once to start a song. His voice trailed off after the second line. Even he, who could usually wrap any experience in melody, seemed to sense that this day needed quieter company. Milva's jaw was set so hard I could almost hear the grind of her teeth. She had loosed more arrows in one night than most archers manage in a month. Her fingers were raw despite the calluses, her shoulders tight from holding tension like a drawn bow. Kahir rode with the rigid posture of a man afraid that if he relaxed even slightly, something inside him would simply collapse. Geralt said little. That was not unusual, but the quality of his silence had changed. It had a weight to it now, as if the night on the bridge had added another stone to the pile he carried. His gaze swept the horizon, not looking for enemies this time, but for something else, a direction, perhaps, a sign that the terrible, exhausting stand we had made had nudged the world even a finger's breadth closer to finding Ciri. It had not. We reached a village at midday that appeared at first glance almost untouched. Roofs were intact. Fields, though trampled in places, still held standing grain. The well had not been fouled. Chickens scratched nervously near doorways. Then the villagers emerged. They moved with the careful slowness of people who had learned that sudden movements draw unwanted attention. Their eyes tracked our weapons first. Then my bag. News travels faster than riders. Before I had even dismounted, a woman tugged at my sleeve, pleading for me to see an old man coughing blood. My tools were still sticky from the night before. My hands ached. Every instinct in me, old and new, urged rest. Yet the old man's breath rattled, and the woman's voice shook on certain words. "Father, last harvest, please." I nodded and followed her to a hut that smelled of damp straw and fatigue. Outside, the others waited in the small space that passes for shade when the sun is high and mercy is low. Dandelion went in search of ale and stories. Milva negotiated for food and information. Cahir lingered near the edge of the square like a man who has forgotten how to belong anywhere. Geralt, I later learned, spoke to a boy who had seen soldiers riding past in the night. Black armour, a wagon with iron bars. Someone within who had screamed once and then fallen silent. Ciri, he must have thought at once. Or someone like her. Either way, the line tightened around his mouth. The old man's lungs were full of more than any draught could dislodge. I eased his breathing for a while, spoke quietly to his daughter about comfort, about accepting natural limits. She nodded, but her hands kept smoothing the blanket, as if stubbornness might yet uncrease time. We both knew I was not really treating him. I was treating her fear of watching him go. When I stepped back into the sunlight, Geralt waited. "A wagon with bars," he said, "heading south. 2 days ago." "How many times have we heard something similar?" I asked. "Too many," he replied, "and never enough." He turned away, looking toward the road that led where the villagers said the wagon had gone. It was a narrow track, half overgrown, disappearing into a fold of land that might hide anything. Refugees, a Nilfgaardian unit, or nothing at all. "We follow," he said. "Of course we follow," Milva answered before anyone else could speak. "We didn't hold that cursed bridge to sit here counting hens." Dandelion emerged from the tavern with a crust of bread, his earlier heaviness masked beneath a thin layer of enthusiasm. Cahir mounted without a word. Our little company, still smelling of last night's smoke and this morning's damp straw, set out once more. The track wound between low, scrub-covered hills. Here and there we passed scenes that might have been peaceful in another age. A shepherd watching his flock, a woman hanging laundry from a line. Yet even those, when looked at closely, carried the marks of strain. The shepherd's staff had metal bands near the top. The woman's eyes darted to the horizon more often than to her work. By late afternoon we found what we had been following. The wagon lay on its side in a shallow ditch, one wheel broken, its bars twisted as if a great force had struck them from within. The horse was gone. The harness had been cut, not broken. No corpses lay nearby, no discarded armour, only the flattened grass of a struggle and the lingering metallic tang of desperation. Milva dismounted at once, moving in widening circles around the wreckage, reading the ground the way I might read a patient's pulse. Geralt joined her. They bent over scuffed earth, broken twigs, faint tracks leading toward and away from the wagon. Their discussion was low-voiced, full of terms of art, drag marks, boot sizes, weight distributions. Cahir stood at the edge of the ditch, staring at the bent bars. His face had gone pale under the road dust. "This is familiar," he said. "We used such wagons for important prisoners, mages, people the Emperor wanted intact." "What do you see?" I asked. He swallowed. "Someone inside," he said slowly, forced the bars outward. "Not cut. Bent. That takes more than ordinary strength." Milva returned, crouched near the overturned wheel. "2 sets of tracks leaving," she said. "One stumbling, being half carried. The other, odd, deep, as if whoever made them was light in body but heavy in intent. If that makes sense?" It did, unfortunately. I thought of stories I had heard of transformations, of power that made footprints not by weight, but by the density of the moment. "It could have been Ciri," Dandelion whispered. as if speaking her name too loudly might break something. "It could have been someone else," Geralt replied. His tone was measured, but his hand curled slightly at his side. "We follow anyway." Yet there was something different in his stride as we took up the trail. Not the desperate haste of earlier weeks, but a harder, more tempered resolve. The night on the bridge, the sight of men choosing to stand and fall so that strangers might cross, had etched itself into him. It was as if the fire had burned away a last layer of illusion about what this search required. We followed the tracks until evening blurred them. They vanished at the edge of a stand of trees where recent rain had washed away all but the faintest impressions. Milva tried more than once to reconstruct the path. At last she straightened, shaking her head. "They could have gone anywhere from here," she said. "North, south, into the trees, or along the ridge. Without fresh sign, we are guessing." Geralt stood very still. The sun slipped behind the hills, drawing long shadows across his face. "We choose," he said. "We keep choosing until there is nothing left to choose." We made camp on a rocky rise overlooking the place where the tracks had dissolved. The air was cooler there, touched by a wind that had flown over places untouched by war. For a moment, as the sky shifted from gold to deep blue, it was possible to imagine we were simply travellers on an ordinary journey, debating which road to take in the morning. But the smoke in our clothes, the ache in Milva's shoulders, the stiff way Cahir unbuckled his armour, the haunted flicker in Dandelion's eyes each time he looked at the broken wagon. Below, these things anchored us firmly in the world as it was. I sat apart for a time, watching them. Geralt, cleaning his swords with steady, almost meditative strokes. Milva stretching her hands, flexing cracked fingers. Cahir polishing his helm as if erasing an old insignia might change the memory it carried. Dandelion, lying on his back, staring up at the first stars, his lips moving silently as if testing possible verses and rejecting them as too small. We were tired, not only in muscle, but in the quieter places where resolve lives. Tired of smoke and blood, of rumours and almost signs, of arriving always just after something terrible or miraculous had already happened. We were, in that moment, like embers blown thin, glowing still but perilously close to going out. And yet none of us spoke of turning back. The road behind us was as scorched as the one ahead. We had crossed too many lines, shared too many confessions, stood on too many bridges together to pretend we could simply resume our old solitary paths. Perhaps you have known a softer version of this fatigue, a long season of caregiving, a project that refuses to end, a family crisis that stretches on past its first sharp pain into a dull, grinding test of endurance. There comes a point when you no longer expect a clear victory. You simply hope not to fail the people walking beside you. As night thickened, Milva finally broke the quiet. "We keep going," she said, "until we cannot. Then we crawl. That is all." No one argued. No one toasted the sentiment or turned it into a slogan. We accepted it the way we accepted the thin blankets around our shoulders. Inadequate, but better than nothing. We like to imagine that resolve is born in moments of grand inspiration, under banners and stirring speeches. Yet we still wonder whether it is not more often forged in evenings like that one, when the trail has gone cold, when the horizon offers no promises, and when the only thing keeping us moving is the knowledge that we have already come too far and seen too much to allow the fire that changed us to have burned for nothing. In stories told later, if anyone bothers to tell them, it will appear as if our fellowship sprang into being fully formed. Witcher, bard, archer, vampire and penitent Nilfgaardian, striding with grim purpose toward destiny. Reality, as usual, was messier. We did not begin as a fellowship. We became one by failing, improvising, and simply refusing to abandon one another when it would have been easier to walk away. In the days after the broken wagon and the vanished tracks, the war receded slightly behind us. Not far, never far, but enough that we could sometimes ride for an hour without seeing smoke. The land softened into low hills and strips of woodland. A brook appeared that had not yet run red. A field of cabbages stood miraculously untrampled, as if the conflict had forgotten it. We took such reprieves greedily. At one farmstead, still inhabited and only partially stripped of food, Milva traded 2 arrows and a warning about nearby scouts for a sack of potatoes and a sour loaf. The farmer's wife, suspicious at first, thawed enough under Dandelion's flattery to offer us a patch of barn floor. That evening felt almost domestic. Geralt repaired a strap by the doorway. Milva, after much muttering, instructed Dandelion on the proper way to peel potatoes without sacrificing half of each to the knife. Cahir, whose noble upbringing had not included kitchen duty, attempted to help and succeeded mainly in looking uncomfortable. I boiled water, laid out clean cloths, checked everyone's bandages and bruises with the absent-minded fussiness of an elderly aunt. There was laughter, eventually, small off-guard bursts, when Dandelion dropped an entire peeled potato into the ashes, when Milva swatted his hand away from the pot, when Cahir tried to tell a joke and mangled the timing. The sound startled us at first, as if someone had opened a door we had forgotten was there. Then we leaned toward it, each in our own way. In quieter lives you may know evenings like that. After a long illness, perhaps, when the first shared joke at the dinner table feels like a fragile victory. Or after months of difficult work, when someone's clumsy remark in the break room suddenly sends everyone into helpless laughter. It is not that the larger problems have vanished. They simply loosen their grip long enough for a little human warmth to leak through. We slept closely packed in the barn, our cloaks overlapping, the smell of hay and horse and smoke mingling into something almost comforting. In the small hours, I woke briefly to find Geralt sitting up, back against a post. Gaze distant. "You should rest," I said softly. "I am," he replied. "For me, this counts." He nodded toward the tangle of sleeping forms around us. "I keep waiting for the moment when this falls apart," he said. "When someone leaves, when I must send someone away. I never meant to gather a company. Few leaders do," I answered. "The ones who seek followers tend to be the least worthy of them. You did not recruit us. We drifted into your orbit because your path cut through the center of too many storms for us to ignore." He considered that, then smiled without humor. "A walking barometer," he said. "Not quite the legend bards promised me." "Legends are for listeners," I replied. "You have companions. It is not the same thing." He looked at me sidelong. "And you? Regis, are you here because my storms interest you, or because you sought a place to test your redemption? The question was not accusatory. It was the honest curiosity of a man trying to understand the forces that kept his unlikely assembly from flying apart. "Both," I said. "I am here because the world is burning, and I grew tired of pretending I could live forever in a pocket of air. I am here because I see in you and in them the same stubborn refusal to become what fate and habit have prepared for you. It is contagious." He grunted, the closest he would come to calling that sentiment foolish and necessary at once. Our fellowship did not harden in grand declarations, but in small, repeated acts. When Milva's ankle twisted on a loose stone, Geralt and Cahir adjusted their pace without comment, so that she did not lag. When Cahir woke from nightmares, sweating and breathless, it was Dandelion who wordlessly passed him a waterskin and began to talk nonsense until the young man's shoulders relaxed. When my hands shook after another day of stitching other people's pain, Milva shoved a cup of broth into them and told me in her gentlest voice to stop thinking so hard. We also argued a great deal about routes, about risks, about when to stop and whom to help. Milva accused Geralt of letting his guilt endanger us. Geralt accused Cahir of seeing every situation through the lens of imperial strategy. Dandelion accused everyone of undervaluing the morale-boosting power of music. I pointed out on more than one occasion that my drafts were not miracles, and that bones could not be bullied into knitting faster. These quarrels did not weaken us. They were the friction by which we learned the shape of one another's convictions. Trust built not on blind agreement, but on the repeated discovery that even when we disagreed fiercely, we did not abandon the table or the trail. It was during this period that we acquired, almost by accident, another companion. We reached a crossroads one afternoon where a gallows had been hastily erected. A single warped beam, ropes dangling, the rough efficiency of field justice. A youth stood on the cart beneath it, wrists bound, chin tilted at an angle that claimed defiance, but barely concealed terror. A small crowd had gathered, including an officious-looking sergeant reading out a list of crimes that had clearly been expanded for entertainment. The accused, he declared, was a thief, a spy, a deserter, a disgrace. The youth, in a voice that cracked at the worst possible moments, protested that she was, in fact, only very talented at liberating other people's property from their unappreciative custody. "I know her," Dandelion whispered. "Angoulême, street rat, petty criminal, occasional informant. Razor tongue, quicker feet. If they hang her, it will be because someone else's guilt needs a neck." The situation required only the lightest of pushes to tip from grim ritual into chaos. Geralt provided that push with his usual economy. A few words to the sergeant, a reminder that his unit was short of scouts, an offer to take responsibility for this troublesome stray. Milva added a glare that strongly implied any refusal would have immediate and unpleasant consequences. Minutes later, Angoulême was riding behind us, hands free, eyes bright with the heady combination of fear and sudden freedom. She talked without pause about the stupidity of the soldiers, the unfairness of being captured while others she knew had done far worse, the scandalous dullness of the countryside. At first, she grated on Milva's patience and Dandelion's pride in equal measure. Cahir stared at her as if unsure what category of being she belonged to. Geralt tolerated her chatter with the air of a man used to weathering storms. I watched, remembering other young faces that had vanished into graves or brothels instead of onto saddles. Within days she had insinuated herself into the gaps we had not known existed. She teased Cahir out of his rigid silence, mocking his posture until he laughed in spite of himself. She challenged Dandelion's accounts of events, forcing him to admit how much he embellished. She followed Milva like an apprentice, learning quickly how to move quietly, how to read the land. To me she brought questions, endless questions, about higher vampires, about whether I could turn into a bat, about why I never drank anything stronger than herbal tea. I answered most with amused deflection. A few I answered honestly, which startled us both. One evening, after an encounter with a band of deserters that had turned ugly before we turned it away, Angoulême sat very close to our fire, knees drawn to her chest. "I thought," she said, "that people like you and the Witcher and the lady with the bow were different. Above all this. But you bleed like anyone else when someone sticks you." Her tone held no disappointment, only a kind of dawning respect. "We are not above," I said. "We are merely more practiced at pretending the blows do not land." She considered that, then nodded. "Good," she said. "If you were gods, I would not know what to do with you." In her blunt way, she named something important. We were no longer, if we ever had been, figures in someone else's heroic saga. We were a family of sorts, bound not by blood or law, but by the stubborn decision to keep folding new strays into our circle instead of pushing them away. Families formed under such pressure are rarely harmonious. Old wounds jostle against new loyalties. Tempers fray. Misunderstandings flare. Yet they also possess a resilience absent from tidier arrangements. When danger came, we did not need to ask whether we would stand together. We already had, too many times, on bridges and at gallows and in quiet rooms, where someone whispered a name they could not bear to lose. We like to imagine that we choose our closest companions with care, after long reflection, as one might select books for a treasured shelf. Yet we still wonder whether, more often, they are simply the ones who happened to be standing near us when the world caught fire, and who, for reasons neither of you can fully explain, did not step away when the smoke grew thick. We did not leave the war behind. No one does. At best, you walk far enough that the sounds grow faint and the smoke thins into memory. Yet there came a stretch of road when, for the first time in many weeks, the horizon was not lined with burning roofs or marching columns. The land softened as we turned west, following rumors that the trail we sought had bent that way. Forests grew deeper, their branches weaving overhead into vaulted ceilings of green. Streams ran clear, carrying only the smell of leaves and stone. Once we crossed a meadow dotted with wildflowers so bright that Angoulême briefly stopped talking. "Looks like a painting," she said at last. "One of those rich folk have in their halls. Only this one doesn't smell of polish." We did not linger, though the air there felt clean enough to wash the soul. The horses needed water, we needed food, and somewhere beyond even this peaceful pocket, the great game of kings and emperors continued to grind forward. The world does not pause because a handful of wanderers have found a beautiful view. Still, something in our pace changed. The frantic edge dulled, replaced by a steadier, more deliberate rhythm. We no longer lunged at every passing rumour like starving dogs at a bone. We weighed what we heard, compared it to the pattern of events we had seen. Geralt, who once would have spurred his horse at the mention of any girl with ashen hair and a sword, now listened a little longer before deciding which fork in the road to take. The fire had not cooled his urgency. It had tempered it. He had stood on a bridge and watched the cost of every decision measured in blood and breath. He had seen how quickly a single choice could tip from protection into sacrifice. That knowledge settled into him like iron cooling in a mould. One evening we camped on a low hill overlooking a river bend. Not a strategic crossing, just a lazy curve where the water slowed briefly to admire the reflection of the sky. The war, for once, was elsewhere. No patrols, no distant drums, only the chirr of insects and the occasional splash of a fish. We set our small, familiar circle of light among the heather. Milva cleaned her bowstring with methodical care. Cahir, armour removed at last, sat with his back against a rock, eyes half closed. Dandelion plucked idly at his lute, the notes drifting more like thoughts than like a song. Angoulême lay on her stomach, chin propped on her hands, tracing patterns in the dust with a twig. Geralt stood a little apart at the crest of the hill, outlined against the fading sky. The wind tugged at his hair and cloak. For a long time he said nothing. We had grown used to his silences, learned to recognize their different flavors. This one felt less like distance than like someone listening for something only he could hear. At last he came down and sat by the fire. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what that Nilfgaardian captain told us near the river. About banners." Dandelion feigned horror. "The Witcher has been thinking about politics," he said. "Truly, the end times are upon us." Milva threw a small twig at him. "Let him talk," she said. "For once, it might be useful." Geralt gave a faint snort, but the line at the corner of his mouth softened. "He said everyone serves a banner," Geralt went on. "That we delude ourselves when we claim neutrality. At the time, I argued, habit. And now, I asked. Now I think he was half right, Geralt said. Maybe more than half. I tried to walk between the fires. I told myself I was only looking for Ciri, that the war could rage around me without pulling me in. But every step we took helped someone and hurt someone else, whether we meant it or not. We held a bridge so others could escape. We turned a hanging into a rescue. We chose which wounded to save first. Those choices drew lines, whether we painted them or not. He poked at the embers with a stick, sending up a small whirl of sparks. So perhaps I do serve a banner after all, he said quietly. It just does not belong to any king. Angoulême rolled onto her back and looked up at the deepening blue. What banner, then? She asked. Geralt hesitated, as if expecting the words to sound foolish aloud. Hers, he said at last. Ciri's, and those like her. Children flung into storms they did not summon. People broken by games they never chose to play. If I must serve something, let it be the stubborn refusal to accept that they are only pieces on other people's boards. Silence settled around his words. The river below murmured its agreement, or perhaps only its indifference. Cahir stirred. When I rode for the Emperor, he said, I told myself his banner represented order. Unity, a better world forged through necessary hardness. It was comforting to believe that obedience itself was a virtue, that one could hand one's choices to a grand design and be absolved of their weight. He looked across the fire at Geralt. "I have no banner now," he said, "no emperor, no crest, only the knowledge of what I have done. Some days that feels like freedom, others like being unmoored. But if you have chosen that girl as your standard, I can think of worse cloth to follow." Milva snorted softly, though her eyes were gentler than her tone. "You men and your banners," she said. "Hang whatever rag you like on your spears. I will keep doing what I can for those who bleed in front of me. If that happens to be in the same direction you are riding, so be it." There was more faith in that throwaway sentence than in most prayers. Dandelion, ill-suited to let a solemn moment stand unornamented, plucked a chord. "I shall write it thus," he declared. "The fellowship of no banner, marching beneath the colours of a missing girl and a series of very bad decisions." We laughed. We needed to. Laughter is how the heart stretches after too long curled around its own pain. Later, when the fire had burned low and the sky was thick with stars, the others drifted one by one into sleep. I remained awake, as is my habit, listening to the quiet. Old instincts never entirely fade. The night speaks in many voices, the rustle of small animals, the distant bark of a fox, the shifting of a companion in dreams. I thought of where we had begun, of that barn that smelled of old milk and fever, of a witcher half broken by wounds refusing to rest, of a bard who used words as both shield and net, of a hunter who pretended not to care, of a Nilfgaardian rider chasing a girl through nightmares, of a vampire hiding from his own reflection behind a barber's chair. The road had changed us. War does that, of course. So does love and guilt and the stubbornness that makes people keep looking for a single lost face in a crowd of tragedies. But there was something else at work too, something quieter. We had, each in our own way, stepped into the fire, not the roaring blaze of great battles alone, but the smaller, more intimate flames. The moment on the bridge when I reached beyond my chosen limits, the moment at the gallows, when Geralt claimed a stranger's life as part of our own. The moment when Cahir said his first unforced no to orders that would have broken someone else. The moment when Milva chose to walk away from the safe patterns of Brokilon and into this thrumming uncertainty. The moment when Dandelion first sang not to be admired, but simply to keep fear from hollowing out the space between us. A baptism is not about water or fire. It is about emergence, about stepping out of something that no longer fits and into something you do not yet understand. We had done that again and again, without ceremony or witness, on roads no chronicler would bother to map. I cannot tell you, listener, how our story ends. Not yet. Ciri's path still twists through the dark ahead. The war continues to redraw its own borders in blood and ash. There will be more bridges, more choices, more nights when the sky presses too low and the heart feels too thin. What I can tell you is this. As we rode on from that quiet hill, leaving the river to its own reflections, there was a new steadiness in our small procession. We were no less afraid. We were certainly no wiser. But we had somehow accepted that there was no path back to who we had been before the flames. Only a path forward, together, carrying both our scars and our stubbornness like lanterns. Perhaps in your own life, the fires are smaller, a loss that will not let you go, a responsibility you never asked for, a choice that weighed more than you expected. You may not have swords or banners or songs, only your two hands, and the people who happen to be walking beside you. Even so, the question that burned in us burns in you too. Who will you be when you step through your own fire? What will you carry with you? And what, at last, will you set down? I have lived long enough to see empires rise and crumble like sandcastles, to watch names once shouted in terror fade into footnotes. What remains, always, are the small, stubborn acts of mercy we offer one another in the midst of the blaze. A bridge held long enough for strangers to cross, a noose cut, a hand extended in the dark. So I will leave you here on this stretch of road where our horses' hoofbeats are fading into the night, and the air still smells faintly of smoke and heather. The rest of the tale will come in its own time. For now, let this be my parting whisper. Hold fast to those quiet choices. Look kindly on the burdens others carry. And when the flames rise, do not be too quick to decide who is monster and who is merely someone trying clumsily not to be. We will ride on, and you, perhaps, will walk a little further with your own companions, still wondering, as we do, what it truly means to pass through a baptism of fire and come out the other side a little less alone.